Section 1. The World That Should Not Work. There is something fundamentally wrong with the town where the Griffin family lives. Not wrong in the way that any town might have its quirks, or the way that any neighborhood might have its share of odd characters and uncomfortable moments. Wrong in a deeper, stranger way. Wrong in the way that suggests the place itself operates according to rules that no one ever agreed to. Rules that shift and bend depending on who needs them to. Rules that seem designed less to govern a functioning society and more to keep certain people trapped in certain places forever. The town is called Quahog. It sits in Rhode Island, somewhere in Newport County, close enough to the coast that you can smell the ocean on certain days, and far enough from Providence that nobody ever comes to check on things. It has a zip code 00093, which was revealed in a Season 7 episode on Peter's driver's license, and which, if you look it up, does not correspond to any real location in the United States. The zip code itself is the first clue. This place exists just outside the edge of the real world. It follows the shape of a real place without actually being one. The founding mythology of Quahog is already strange. According to the lore established across several episodes, the town was founded in the 17th century by a man named Griffin Peterson, an ancestor of Peter Griffin. After Peterson was exiled from England to the New World, he won governance of the settlement through a musical competition, and the prize included being reunited with a woman named Lady Redbush after her divorce from the king. So, the town that the Griffins call home was literally won in a singing contest by their own ancestor, a man whose name is a direct mashup of the family's surname and the word Peter. The founding father of the place these characters are trapped in is, essentially, a version of the main character who came before the main character. That circularity never stops. Nothing in Quahog ever truly starts or ends. People cycle through the same situations. Relationships reset, deaths unhappen. Children never grow up, or grow up only slightly, or grow up in one episode and return to their previous age the next week without explanation. The town has been partially or completely destroyed multiple times by Peter's ongoing battle with a giant chicken, by alien invasions, by Y2K nuclear catastrophe in a Season 2 episode, and yet every Monday morning, functionally, the houses are back, the streets are intact, and the same people are sitting in the same bar telling the same kinds of jokes. This is the thing that separates Quahog from every other fictional town in animated television. Springfield, in The Simpsons, has its inconsistencies, but there is always a sense that it exists in a kind of continuous present that acknowledges the logic of the world outside it. South Park, Colorado has rules that the show breaks deliberately for satirical effect, but the breaking of those rules is always the point. Quahog is different. In Quahog, the rules seem to break passively, without intention, as though the town itself has given up trying to be coherent and is just doing whatever the moment requires. And this quality, this fundamental wrongness in the fabric of the place, is exactly what has made Family Guy one of the most fertile grounds for fan theories in the history of animated television. When a fictional world operates with obvious internal logic, fan theories tend to be relatively small. They fill in gaps. They connect dots that the writers left close together. But when a fictional world operates the way Quahog does, when the rules are bent so routinely and so casually that nothing can be taken at face value, the imagination of the audience has almost unlimited room to run. Every inconsistency becomes a possible clue. Every break in continuity becomes a potential piece of evidence for something larger. Every moment where the show seems to contradict itself becomes a breadcrumb on a trail leading somewhere darker and more interesting than the surface story would suggest. Over the course of more than 25 years on the air, Family Guy has generated an enormous body of fan theories. Some of them are playful and lighthearted, fun little ideas that make you smile and then forget. Some of them are genuinely clever, built on real attention to the details of the show and constructed with a kind of internal logic that holds up surprisingly well under scrutiny. And some of them are dark. Not dark in the way that cartoon violence is dark, or dark in the way that an edgy joke is dark, but dark in the way that makes you look back at a story you thought you understood and realize you may have been misreading it completely from the beginning. It is worth spending a moment understanding why this particular show generates these kinds of theories so naturally. Part of it is the sheer volume of the show. Family Guy has been running since the 31st of January 1999, when its first episode aired right after Super Bowl 33 to an audience of around 22 million viewers. That first episode, Death Has a Shadow, established the template: a suburban family in Rhode Island, a talking dog, a baby with an inexplicably sophisticated British accent and ambitions toward world domination, and a style of comedy that mixed conventional sitcom plotting with surreal cutaway gags that had nothing to do with anything. Over the decades, the show has produced more than 400 episodes across more than 20 seasons, and it has secured renewals that will keep it running through at least the 2028 to 2029 television season. That is a lot of material. That is a lot of moments to reinterpret, a lot of lines to reread, a lot of background details to notice and wonder about. Part of it is the show's own relationship to continuity. Family Guy has never been a show that takes its own history especially seriously. Characters have died and come back. Events that were presented as permanent have been retconned or simply ignored in subsequent episodes. The same characters have had origin stories that contradict each other. The show has explicitly acknowledged that it operates in an alternate universe, or multiple alternate universes, or a simulation depending on which episode you happen to be watching. This deliberate looseness with its own reality invites the audience to fill in the gaps with their own explanations, because the official explanations are either absent or openly unreliable. Part of it is the unique quality of the show's humor, which has always operated on at least two levels simultaneously. On one level, Family Guy is a broad, irreverent, occasionally cruel comedy about a dysfunctional family. On another level, it is a show that is constantly gesturing toward things that lie beyond the boundaries of what it is officially saying: cultural references, meta-commentary, self-awareness about its own existence as a television program. This dual quality makes it easy for viewers to feel that there is always something more going on beneath the surface, because the show itself keeps suggesting that there is. And then there is the water theory. This is a minor theory, one that does not get as much attention as some of the others, but it is worth beginning here because it establishes the essential spirit of what fan theorizing about this show feels like. The theory goes like this: the drinking water in Quahog is contaminated with something, and has been for a long time. The evidence is the behavior of the town's residents. Normal human beings do not act the way the people of Quahog act. They are not capable of the levels of violence, absurdity, and casual disregard for consequence that the citizens of this town display on a weekly basis. Something in their biology has been altered. Something in their cognitive function has been changed. Whatever they are drinking or breathing or absorbing through the soil they walk on has made them into people who operate by a different set of standards than the rest of humanity. The theory cites specific in-universe moments where characters have exhibited behavior that would be clinically impossible in a neurotypical human being. It points to the way that the Griffin House itself seems to exist in a space where physics operates differently: rooms that change size between episodes, a basement that may or may not connect to an underground facility depending on the season, a neighborhood layout that rearranges itself without comment. It suggests that the founding of Quahog by Griffin Peterson, a man who was exiled from England for reasons the show has never fully explained, planted something in the genetic or environmental history of this place that has been amplifying over the centuries. It is a small theory, but it captures something true about what the most interesting theories about this show all share. They all start from the same premise: that something is deeply and deliberately wrong about this world, and that if you pay close enough attention, the shape of that wrongness begins to reveal itself. What follows is a journey through every significant conspiracy, theory, and hidden layer that the audience of Family Guy has assembled over more than 2 decades of watching this strange, baffling, endlessly provocative show. Some of these theories are gentle, some are disturbing, some will change the way you think about episodes you have seen a dozen times, and some of them, if you let them, will sit with you long after the lights are out and the voices of the Griffins have faded into the quiet. Let us begin with the one that started it all. The one that went viral in 2012 and spread across the internet like something contagious. The theory that is sometimes called the darkest fan theory ever written, and that the people who have encountered it tend to describe with the same word: haunting. If you're watching this late at night, wherever you are in the world, drop a comment letting me know. Tell me your time and your location. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is a good time. It really does help more than you know. Section 2. The darkest fan theory ever written: Peter is already gone. On the 7th of August 2012, A Reddit user posting under the name bblank0308 submitted a piece of writing to the subreddit r fan theories that would eventually reach hundreds of thousands of people, go viral on TikTok a decade later, and permanently alter the way a significant portion of the show's audience thinks about what they are actually watching. The post began with a simple question. Have you ever wondered how the entire Griffin family has been able to get into all sorts of hijinks, ranging from the paranormal to the societal, without there ever being any real repercussions? The answer the post proposed was this. There are no repercussions because none of it is real. The events of Family Guy take place inside the mind of a man who has lost everything, and who has constructed an elaborate interior world to protect himself from a grief so enormous that his sanity could not survive contact with it in its unfiltered form. The theory begins with Meg. In the real world, according to this theory, Meg Griffin was a beautiful girl. She was popular in school. She was at the prime of her teenage years. She had a younger brother named Chris who had been born with a cognitive disability because he did not receive enough oxygen during his delivery. Meg loved Chris unconditionally, and in a way that most people could not fully understand. She was the one who advocated for him, who made sure people treated him with dignity, who showed up for him in every way a sister could. One night, Meg took Chris to a party. She had been drinking. On the drive home, she lost control of the car. Both Meg and Chris died in the accident. Lois, already struggling under the weight of her family's difficulties, was pregnant at the time with a son that Peter had decided to name Stewie. The loss of 2 of her children while carrying a third, combined with the grief that followed, was more than she could survive. Lois took her own life while still pregnant. The baby she was carrying, the one Peter had been so excited about, the one he had already given a name, was never born, and Peter could not hold it together. He was committed. He was placed in a psychiatric facility and he is still there. He has been there the entire time. What we see when we watch Family Guy, every episode, every adventure, every cutaway, every fight and reconciliation and absurd disaster, is the interior of a mind that has been shattered by loss and is desperately, unconsciously trying to rebuild something livable out of the wreckage. The theory explains almost every major characteristic of the show through this lens, and the explanations are uncomfortably precise. Why does everyone treat Meg so badly? Because Peter created her in his mind as a version of the real Meg, but he cannot fully divorce her from his resentment. He knows, somewhere in the buried part of his consciousness, that Meg was driving that night. He knows that her choices set the events in motion. He cannot forgive her, even though he also cannot quite make himself hate her completely. Which is why the show contains those rare episodes where Peter shows genuine affection for his daughter moments, where the part of him that loved her in the real world briefly surfaces through the constructed narrative. Why is Stewie a genius? Because Peter never got to meet his son. He never got to know him, never got to find out who he was going to be. So in the world inside his head, Stewie is everything Peter could have hoped for: brilliant, capable, ahead of everyone around him in every measurable way. Stewie's desire to kill Lois, the running joke of the show's early seasons, reflects the part of Peter's mind that holds Lois responsible for her own death. He cannot process the suicide directly, so it comes out sideways, filtered through the character of an infant who expresses Peter's suppressed fury in the language of cartoon villainy. Why is Brian the most intelligent and thoughtful member of the household? Because Brian is not really a dog. Brian is the part of Peter that is still functioning. The theory suggests that Peter was, in reality, a smart man far more capable than the buffoon he portrays himself as in his interior world. He made himself stupid in the narrative because he feels like he failed as a father and a husband. He could not protect his family. He could not see what was coming. He judges himself to be an idiot, and so the character he plays in his own head is one. But he cannot fully suppress his real intelligence. So it escapes through Brian, the talking dog who reads books, who has opinions, who sees clearly when everyone around him does not. Why does Chris have a cognitive disability within the show? Because Peter remembers the real Chris, the one who was born without enough oxygen and cannot bring himself to give the interior version of his son a mind that Chris himself never had. It would feel like a betrayal of who Chris actually was. Why do Cleveland and Quagmire appear so regularly? Because they are Peter's real friends. They actually do visit him. They sit with him in the facility and they try to help, and sometimes they play along with his version of reality because it seems to make him calmer, seems to help. The show captures these visits as the two men appearing in Peter's suburban fantasy showing up at the Drunken Clam, participating in whatever situation Peter has generated, trying to keep him anchored. And then there is the detail about Cleveland that the theory considers its most compelling piece of evidence. Cleveland, over time, stops appearing as frequently as he did in the early seasons. By the time Cleveland got his own spin-off show, The Cleveland Show, his presence in Family Guy had markedly diminished. The theory says this is because Cleveland eventually stopped being able to help Peter indulge his fantasy without losing himself in it. He found that spending too much time engaging with Peter's constructed world was starting to affect his own grip on reality. So he stepped back, he reduced his visits, and the show, from inside Peter's mind, interpreted Cleveland's absence as Cleveland moving away, generating a whole spin-off universe centered on Cleveland's departure as a way of explaining why one of the few external anchors to the real world was no longer showing up. Joe is different from the others. The theory is specific about this. Peter never actually met Joe. Joe moved into the house next door after Peter was admitted to the facility, and Cleveland and Quagmire told Peter about him during visits, told him about this new neighbor, this police officer in a wheelchair, a strong man and a devoted father, despite his disability. Peter, who had failed at being a father himself, who had failed to protect his own children, created an interior version of Joe as the embodiment of everything he felt he should have been. Joe in the show is heroic. Joe is dedicated. Joe does not let his disability define him or diminish him. Joe is the father and the man that Peter, in his darkest hours, wishes he had been. The theory has several moments within the show that it considers particularly significant. There is the way that consequences simply do not stick. Peter drives through a wall, and the wall is repaired by the next scene. The family is destroyed and rebuilt within the span of a single episode. Major changes to the status quo are consistently undone before the next week. This is not lazy writing, the theory says. This is the mind of a grieving man constructing a world where things can always be fixed, where the worst outcomes can always be reversed, where the people he loves never have to stay dead. There are the moments, scattered throughout the series, where Peter shows a flash of genuine, tender love for his family that feels completely at odds with his otherwise selfish and reckless characterization. These moments, the theory suggests, are not inconsistencies. They are the real Peter bleeding through the man who actually loved these people, who is sitting in a room somewhere in Rhode Island imagining that he can still hug them, still make them laugh, still be there for them in the ways he failed to be when they were alive. There is the fact that the show has become, over the decades, progressively darker and more mean-spirited. In the early seasons, there was warmth. There was affection between the characters. The family loved each other imperfectly but genuinely. In the later seasons, that warmth has largely drained away, replaced by something colder and more hostile. The theory says this is because Peter is deteriorating. The mind that generates these stories is not healing over time. It is getting worse. The world inside his head is getting grimmer as he gets older, as the facility becomes more familiar than the life he is trying to remember, as the distance between the real past and the imagined present grows too great to bridge. One Reddit user responding to the original post noted something that the original theory had not considered: the way the show handles death. Characters die and return with a frequency that would be alarming in any other context. Brian was killed by a car in the season 12 episode Life of Brian, and the grief that followed was presented as real and lasting, and then 2 episodes later, Stewie used his time machine to prevent the death from ever happening. Brian came back as though the whole thing had never occurred. The commenter suggested that this particular arc might be the theory's most emotionally resonant evidence, because it reflects the way that grief actually works inside a mind that cannot accept loss. You know they are gone, you feel the absence, and then something in you reaches for a mechanism, any mechanism, to bring them back. The theory was first posted in 2012 and earned several hundred upvotes over the following years. It went genuinely viral on TikTok in late 2022 when users began posting about it under the phrase, "Look up the Family Guy theory," with the suggestion that it was scary and disturbing. Millions of people did, and many of them reported the same experience. Watching the show was never quite the same afterward. What makes this theory so effective is not just its cleverness. It is the fact that it is built on something emotionally true. The idea that a mind in sufficient pain constructs alternative realities as a survival mechanism is not fiction, it is a documented phenomenon. The idea that a loving parent might remake their worst loss into a story where the people they lost are still there, still bickering, still making terrible decisions, still somehow alive and nearby, that is the kind of thing that grief can actually do to a person. When you watch Peter Griffin stumble through another episode of his life, making bad choices and facing minimal consequences, it is easy to see him as a buffoon. The theory asks you to see something else. A man sitting very still somewhere, while inside his mind, he plays out a version of his family story where nobody ever has to stay gone. That changes things. That changes a great deal. But the Peter theory, as haunting as it is just the beginning. Because there is another character whose position within this fictional universe raises even more profound questions. A baby in a yellow shirt and a diaper who may be the single most powerful entity in the entire history of this show, and whose relationship to time, reality, and the mechanics of the universe he inhabits is far stranger and far more consequential than it has ever been given credit for. Section 3. Stewie Griffin, the baby who holds the universe together. Let us start with a fact that the show itself established explicitly in the Season 8 episode titled The Big Bang Theory. In that episode, Stewie and Brian get into a fight while operating the time machine. They press the wrong buttons. The machine malfunctions and transports them outside the space-time continuum entirely into a state of non-existence, a place without past, present, or future, a blank canvas where none of the laws of physics apply. Brian has a return pad that should be able to bring them back, but the return pad operates on the laws of physics, and in a place where there are no laws of physics, it cannot function correctly. The only way back is to overload the return pad's reactor and use the explosion to blow themselves back into the universe. The explosion works. They return home. And then, a few days later, Stewie brings Brian a diagram comparing the cosmic background radiation of the Big Bang, the foundational event that created the entire universe, to the energy spectrum of the return pad's explosion. They match exactly. The explosion that brought Stewie and Brian home from outside the space-time continuum was the Big Bang. The universe was created by Stewie Griffin's time machine malfunctioning. Stewie built the device that indirectly brought all of existence into being. He exists in a temporal causality loop where the universe created Stewie so that Stewie could create the universe, so that the universe could create Stewie endlessly, with no beginning and no origin point that is not also a consequence of itself. The show played this as a clever, self-aware gag. The audience laughed. The episode moved on. But the fan theory community noticed something. If this event is taken as canon, and it was presented on screen as unambiguously real, not as a dream, or a simulation, or a what-if scenario, then it has implications that the show itself has never fully reckoned with. Stewie Griffin is not just an evil genius baby with a time machine. He is the foundational cause of all existence. Everything that has ever happened or ever will happen traces its origin back to a moment that Stewie accidentally created. He is not living inside the universe. The universe is living inside a consequence of his actions. This gives the theories about Stewie's role in the show a cosmic dimension that most discussions of his character do not address. The most widely discussed theory about Stewie, the one that gets the most traction in fan communities, is the de-aging theory. And it begins with a problem that the show has always had but never adequately explained. Nobody ages in Quahog. Or rather, they age imprecisely and selectively, in ways that suggest aging is not a natural process happening to these characters, but a managed one, with someone or something controlling the rate at which time moves for different individuals. Meg is 16 in Season 1 and 18 in the mid-seasons, a rate of aging so slow as to be almost imperceptible across a decade and a half of broadcast time. Brian is 7 years old for most of the show, then becomes 10, a jump that happens without any corresponding passage of time in the narrative. Stewie celebrates a second birthday at some point in the series, despite being officially 1 year old for the entirety of its run. Bonnie Swanson was pregnant for approximately 8 seasons before she finally gave birth. The standard explanation for this is that Family Guy, like most animated comedies, operates on a floating timeline where the characters exist in a kind of permanent present that updates its cultural references and technology without aging its characters. This is true, and it is the intended explanation. But the de-aging theory proposes something more interesting. It goes like this. At some point in the future, a future that Stewie has already visited using his time machine, he allowed himself to grow up. He saw what adulthood looked like for him. The show has depicted this directly. In the episode Stu and Stewie's Excellent Adventure, the third segment of the feature film Stewie Griffin, The Untold Story, we meet Stu Griffin, who is Stewie at 35 years old. And Stu is miserable. He works at a Quiznos, lives alone, has accomplished nothing, and is deeply, profoundly unhappy. The genius has not materialized into anything. The ambition has curdled into emptiness. More importantly, and this is the part the theory hinges on, Stewie saw Brian in that future. An older, slower Brian. A Brian showing the signs of age that dogs show more quickly than humans. A Brian who was visibly diminished. Stewie could not accept it. The theory proposes that Stewie, faced with the prospect of Brian growing old and dying while he grew into a disappointing adult, did what anyone with a time machine and a sufficient understanding of molecular biology would do. He invented a way to reverse the aging process. He perfected a device. The theory describes it as something like the neuralizer from Men in Black that could reset the biological age of anyone it was pointed at and simultaneously erase their memories of what had preceded. That reset. He used it on the entire family. He used it on the entire town. He turned himself back into a baby. He reset Brian to the age of 7. He gave everyone a version of their memories that did not include whatever had happened before the reversal. This is why the continuity is so broken. The device was not perfect. Some memories survived in fragmented form. Some events that should have been erased left traces that contradict the official timeline. The gaps and inconsistencies that make Family Guy's internal history so difficult to map are not the result of careless writing. They are the scars left by the memory wipe, the places where the erased version of events bleeds through the replacement. The theory also explains Stewie's character shift. In the earliest seasons, Stewie was dangerous, menacing, genuinely threatening. He built weapons, he had schemes. His murderous impulses toward Lois were presented as a real and active part of his personality. But in later seasons, all of that softened. He became gentler, more emotional, more focused on his friendship with Brian and his own personal insecurities. The show attributed this to the writers making a deliberate creative choice. The theory suggests something more in-universe, that Stewie had gone back in time so many times, had reset and restarted, and altered so many things, that the accumulated weight of all those alternate timelines was affecting him on a fundamental level. He was losing the sharpness of his early self. The evil genius was being worn down not by growth but by repetition, by the same loops of experience playing out again and again in slightly different configurations. There is another element of the Stewie theory that deserves serious attention: the question of who can hear him. In the early seasons of the show, there was a consistent joke built around the fact that most of the adults around Stewie could not understand him. They heard baby babble, where the audience heard articulate, menacing monologues. The comedy of Stewie's character depended on this gap, the dramatic irony of knowing what he was saying, while the people he was targeting remained blissfully unaware. But this element of the character disappeared gradually and almost entirely by the later seasons. By the time the show was in its double-digit season counts, virtually every character could understand Stewie perfectly well, and his inability to be understood had become simply a joke that the show no longer told. There was no explanation given for this shift. The theory community has proposed several explanations, but the most compelling one connects to the de-aging device. If Stewie wiped the memories of everyone around him and reset the timeline, the rules that had governed his existence before the reset no longer applied in quite the same way. He was starting fresh in a world that was technically the same world, but had been rebooted from a new configuration. The people around him had been reset, but Stewie himself retained all his memories, which means he occupied a slightly different relationship to the social fabric around him than he had in the original timeline. And in this new configuration, the barrier between his speech and the comprehension of the people around him was simply weaker, an artifact of the imperfect reset, a seam in the reconstruction. The episode Yug Ilimov, that is, Family Guy, spelled backward, which was the title given to the show's 200th episode, adds another layer. In that episode, Brian's misuse of the time machine causes the flow of time itself to reverse. Stewie begins moving backward toward the moment of his own birth. And if Brian cannot repair the machine in time, Stewie will be literally unborn. The episode plays this as comedic suspense, but the implication is extraordinary. If Stewie ceases to exist, the universe ceases to exist. The Big Bang never happens. Everything that has ever occurred, in the world of the show and by extension in the world that the show implies surrounds it, simply does not. One baby's existence is the load-bearing element of all of reality. There is a version of this theory that goes even darker. It suggests that what we are watching in Family Guy is not a single timeline at all, but the most recent in a series of resets, the latest iteration of a loop that has been running for an indeterminate length of time, with Stewie pulling the lever at the end of each cycle and sending everyone back to the beginning because the alternative is a future he has seen and cannot bear to let arrive. Every episode in this reading is a piece of a story that has already ended, many times, and is being told again. The characters are caught in Stewie's amber, preserved at the ages and in the configurations that allow him to feel safest, most in control, most certain that the thing he fears most, losing Brian to time, cannot happen. This might sound like an extreme reading, but the show itself gave it its foundation when it revealed that Stewie accidentally caused the Big Bang. In a universe where that is canonical, the idea that a one-year-old child is perpetually resetting the timeline to preserve his best friend is not the most outlandish claim on offer. There is one more thing worth noting about the Stewie theory before moving on. The show, in its later seasons, began to explore the question of Stewie's identity and sexuality with increasing frequency. Episodes made it clear that Stewie has attractions to men, that his gender expression is fluid, that there are aspects of himself that he is still discovering, and that the show does not fully resolve. Some viewers interpret this as the show finding new territory to explore with a character whose original premise had been exhausted. The theory community offers a different reading, that Stewie's uncertainty about who he is reflects a deeper and more literal uncertainty. A being who has lived through multiple resets of the timeline, who has been everyone and no one and everything in between at various points, who created the universe by accident and has been managing the consequences ever since, such a being might reasonably struggle with questions of identity. He has been a baby for what is, if you count all the loops, an incomprehensibly long time. He has had friendships that ended and were restarted. He has had a personality that was, in a literal sense, partially erased and rebuilt. Who would you be if your own continuity had been interrupted and rewritten? Stewie Griffin does not know who he is because he has been too many things for too long. And the show keeps circling back to that question without landing on an answer, because the answer would require acknowledging a history that the character himself does not have full access to. The baby in the yellow shirt is not a joke. He is the oldest thing in the universe. He just cannot remember it. Section 4. Brian Griffin wrote everything. Here is something that the show confirmed in the episode Inside Family Guy, which aired in season 15. The Griffin family is playing fictionalized versions of themselves in a television show. This is presented as a meta-joke, the show winking at its own artificiality, acknowledging that it is a constructed narrative rather than a documentary of real events. The audience laughs, the episode continues, and most people do not think much more about it. But a segment of the theory community found that single premise, the Griffins as actors playing themselves in a fictional version of their own lives, and pulled on it until a much larger and stranger theory emerged. If the Griffins are actors playing fictionalized versions of themselves, who is writing the show they are in? The answer that the most detailed version of this theory arrives at is Brian. The evidence begins with what we know about Brian in the world of the show. He is a writer. He is a dog who has published books, written plays, attempted journalism, and maintained the self-image of a serious literary figure for the entire run of the series. His greatest failure, the one that haunts him across multiple seasons, is his inability to finish a novel he has been working on for years. The book is called Faster Than the Speed of Love, and it never gets completed within the show's primary narrative. His one major publishing success, the self-help book Wish It, Want It, Do It, is a work he produced quickly and with minimal effort, which became enormously successful, which Brian then found himself despising. The theory suggests that Brian is not failing to finish his novel. He is writing something much larger. he is writing the show itself. The argument for this is built on several interlocking pieces of evidence. First, Brian is the character who, throughout the run of the show, is most consistently aware that something about the reality around him is unusual. He is one of the only characters who can understand Stewie. He is one of the only characters who has significant memories of events from previous episodes, a quality the show has explicitly called out, noting that Brian is one of the few members of the household who remembers things that happened in earlier seasons. He has a relationship to the continuity of the narrative that the other characters simply do not share. This is what you would expect from someone who is, on some level, observing and documenting the world around him rather than just living in it. Second, Seth MacFarlane has noted that Brian is the character he voices using his natural speaking voice. Not a character voice, not an affectation, but the voice MacFarlane uses when he is being himself. This blurring of the line between creator and creation has led theorists to suggest that Brian is, in a very real sense, the version of Seth MacFarlane that lives inside the show. If MacFarlane is the author of Family Guy, then Brian, his most autobiographical character, the one whose voice is his own, is the author of the world that MacFarlane has created. They are mirrors of each other, the real writer and the fictional one, producing the same story from opposite sides of the screen. Third, the quality of the show's writing correlates, in the theory's framework, with the quality of Brian's mental state. In the early seasons, when Brian was sharp and purposeful and had a clear sense of what he valued, the writing was precise and inventive. In the later seasons, when Brian began drinking more heavily, using drugs more frequently, and becoming less and less coherent as a person, the show became, by widespread critical consensus, sloppier and more random. The cutaway gags became less connected to anything. The plots became thinner. The character behavior became more inconsistent. If you accept that Brian is writing the show, then Brian's decline is a direct editorial explanation for why the show declined. He is not just getting worse as a character, he is getting worse as a writer, and the product he is producing is reflecting that deterioration. The theory developed a particularly devoted following around the question of Brian's drinking. One Reddit post expanded the idea in a direction that a number of people found genuinely persuasive. That Brian's continued and escalating alcohol and drug use is, within the logic of the show's universe, having a measurable effect on the narrative product. The plots are becoming less coherent because the person constructing them is less coherent. The jokes are becoming more random because the mind organizing them can no longer maintain the internal logic that made them land. The character inconsistencies, the way Brian will be a compassionate, thoughtful friend in one episode and a callous, self-serving opportunist in the next, are the literary equivalent of a paragraph that a drunk person has written, revised again, and then revised a third time without remembering what they originally intended to say. There is one episode that the theory considers its most direct piece of evidence, the episode Brian and Stewie, which aired in Season 8. In it, Brian and Stewie are locked in a bank vault over the weekend and have nothing to do but talk to each other. There are no cutaways, there are no subplots, there is no action. It is just two characters in a small space, being honest with each other about things they would normally never say out loud. Brian reveals that he keeps a loaded gun in a safety deposit box in that very vault. When Stewie asks why, Brian admits that there are times when he thinks about using it on himself. He has thought about ending things. The gun is his option of last resort. In the context of the theory that Brian is writing the show, this moment reads differently than it does as a simple character beat. It reads as a writer acknowledging, inside his own work, that the project he is engaged in has become something he is no longer certain he wants to continue. The show that Brian is writing has been running so long, through so many resets and reversals and reboots, that the person generating it is exhausted in a way that goes beyond what the narrative has been acknowledging. The gun in the vault is the author's note. The episode, Life of Brian, in which Brian is killed by a car in the street and the family mourns him, has a particular resonance in this framework. If Brian is the author of the show, his death is the show attempting to write itself past its own author. For 2 episodes, the narrative tries to continue without the person generating it. A replacement character, another dog named Vinny, is introduced. The family tries to adapt. Nothing quite works. The show feels wrong in a way that even people who are not familiar with the theory can usually articulate when they watch those episodes. And then Stewie brings Brian back, because without Brian, the story cannot continue. The author must be retrieved. The pen must be returned to its owner. One additional strand of the Brian theory connects to the American Dad universe and to a character named Klaus. Klaus is the German-speaking goldfish who lives with the Smith family in American Dad. His backstory, as established in that show's mythology, is that Klaus was a German ski jumper whose brain was transplanted into a goldfish's body by the CIA. He is a human consciousness living inside an animal. Both shows share the same creator. Both shows have been confirmed within their own episodes to exist in the same universe. Characters cross over. Events in one show are referenced in the other. The theory notes that if it is possible in the McFarlane universe for a human brain to be placed inside a fish, it is equally possible for a human brain to be placed inside a dog. And if you accept that premise, everything about Brian suddenly makes sense in a way that no other explanation can fully account for. The ability to speak, the ability to drive a car, the ability to date human women, the literary ambitions, the human emotional landscape, the attraction to Lois. The fact that Brian was the only puppy from his litter to behave in any way other than as a dog. The fact that he has a 13-year-old son with a human woman, a biological implausibility that the show has never satisfactorily explained. Brian is not a dog who thinks like a person. Brian is a person who is living inside a dog. Someone performed the same procedure on him that the CIA performed on Klaus, possibly for the same reasons, possibly for different ones. And the Brian that the Griffin family adopted from the streets of Quahog was already carrying inside him a consciousness that had once belonged to a human being. This connects to the question of who Brian actually was before he was Brian. The theory does not reach a definitive conclusion on this point, and the show itself has never addressed it. But the suggestion most commonly offered is that Brian's original human consciousness has a connection to the Griffin family that predates his adoption, that whoever Brian was before, he had a reason to find his way back to them, and that the writing he is doing, the show he is generating from inside the fiction of his own life, is his way of telling a story that he was somehow involved in long before he became the dog that Peter picked up off the street. Brian Griffin is the author of the world he lives in. He is doing it badly because he has been doing it for a very long time, and because the substances he consumes make precision increasingly difficult, and because the story he is trying to tell keeps resisting him. But he is the one holding the pen, and the question of who he was before he picked it up is one that the show will probably never answer. Section 5. The Purgatory Problem. Nobody in Quahog is alive. The theory that the Griffin family and the residents of Quahog are dead has been circulating since at least the mid-2000s, and it takes several forms. Some versions propose hell, some propose purgatory, some propose a more secular version of the same idea, a kind of spiritual holding pattern, neither punishment nor reward, where the dead are given the opportunity to work through whatever it is that prevented them from moving on. The most developed version of this theory uses purgatory as its framework, primarily because purgatory is the version that best accounts for what the show actually looks like when you watch it carefully. Hell is a state of permanent suffering. Purgatory is a state of impermanent suffering. Suffering with a purpose. Suffering that is meant to lead somewhere eventually. And the world of Family Guy, for all its darkness, is not purely punishing. It contains moments of joy, moments of connection, moments where something genuinely good happens to these characters. It is a world that seems designed to give its inhabitants the opportunity to learn something, even if they consistently fail to take it. The theory maps each major character to a sin that defined their life before they died, and to a form of torment that constitutes their purgatorial existence. Peter was a bully. Not a cartoonish, obvious bully, but the kind of person who used laughter and spectacle to maintain dominance over others while avoiding accountability for the harm he caused. He was loud and domineering. He made himself the center of attention at the expense of the people around him. He was cruel in the casual, thoughtless way that many people are cruel not because he intended harm, but because he was not paying enough attention to notice when he was causing it. His punishment in purgatory is to be surrounded by people who are not afraid of him. His wife stands up to him. His children, in their own ways, push back. His friends, the ones he used to dominate, have their own lives and their own needs that do not orbit around Peter the way he would prefer. and the cruelty he inflicted on others has been turned back on him, not as retribution but as a mirror of the universe showing him what it looks like when someone treats the people around them as props rather than people. The theory notes that the more extreme Peter's behavior becomes in the later seasons, the more his victims push back, the more consequences he faces, and the less he seems to learn from any of it. He is stuck because he will not take the lesson. Lois was vain, in the fullest sense of that word. She was raised in privilege, and she used her appearance and her social status to get things she wanted and to avoid things she did not want. She was, in her earlier life, the kind of woman who saw other people primarily as reflections of herself, as confirmation of her own worth when they admired her, as threats when they did not. She loved Peter, or she came to love him, but her love for him was always entangled with her satisfaction at being the person who managed him, who was clearly the more capable of the two, who held the household together and made everything work. Her purgatorial existence places her in a household that will not acknowledge any of those things. She is a housewife in a family that does not respect her. Her intelligence goes unrecognized. Her patience is taken for granted. The beauty and social status that she used as currency in her previous life have been rendered meaningless in a context where the people around her are too chaotic to care about such things. The theory cites the way Lois has become colder and more detached in the show's later seasons as evidence that she is failing her test, becoming more self-serving and more openly contemptuous of the family she is supposed to be learning to truly love without conditions. Brian is perhaps the most precisely matched character in the theory's framework. He was an intellectual who used his intelligence as a weapon and a shield, who substituted knowing things for actually growing, who looked down on people from a constructed elevation that protected him from having to be vulnerable. His failure was the failure of intelligence divorced from wisdom, knowing everything about the world without knowing himself. His purgatorial existence traps him in the body of a dog, a creature that, regardless of how well it speaks or drives or drinks martinis, is still classified as an animal by the world around it. A creature that cannot be taken seriously as a writer no matter how many books it publishes, because it is still a dog, and dogs do not write books. His intelligence, the thing he most valued about himself, is rendered permanently suspect by the body it is housed in. The theory notes that Brian's increasing insufferability in the later seasons, his pomposity, his hypocrisy, his inability to see himself clearly reflects the progressive failure of someone who keeps getting the same lesson and keeps refusing to hear it. Stewie's position in the purgatory theory is the most complex, and the one that the theory spends the most time on. The simplest framing is that Stewie was a violent person in his previous life, someone who used power to dominate others, who inflicted suffering without compunction, who placed his own ambitions so far above the needs of the people around him that those people simply ceased to exist as real to him. His purgatorial form places him in the body that is the definition of powerlessness, an infant. He has all his faculties, all his intelligence, all his memories of who he was, but no physical power, no social standing, no ability to execute on any of his ambitions without the assistance of a talking dog. He is literally dependent on the people he spent his previous life treating as inferior. The theory suggests that Stewie's arc toward becoming a softer, more emotionally open person in the later seasons of the show represents genuine purgatorial progress, that he is actually learning something, that the lessons are landing in a way they are not landing for Peter or Brian. Whether he eventually completes the lesson and moves on is something the show has never addressed. Meg is the theory's most interesting case, because the purgatory framework raises a question about her that has no comfortable answer. What sin did a teenager commit that was so significant it landed her here? The theory's most common response is that Meg is not being punished. Meg is a guide. She is one of the entities whose role in purgatory is not to serve out a sentence, but to create the conditions under which the others might eventually learn what they need to learn. She endures the abuse heaped on her, not because she deserves it, but because her endurance is the thing that the others are supposed to respond to with compassion, and their consistent failure to do so is the measure of how far I still have to go. This reading makes Meg the most tragic figure in the theory's framework. She is not a sinner. She is a functionary of the process. She is there to be treated badly so that the people treating her badly have the opportunity to choose differently. And they keep choosing wrong. The theory points to one scene in particular as its most powerful piece of evidence: the season 10 episode, Seahorse Seashell Party. In that episode, Meg finally confronts her family and tells them exactly what they have made her feel. She is articulate, she is devastating, and for a few moments, you think this might be the turning point, the moment when the family finally hears the lesson that has been in front of them all along. And then the episode ends with Meg taking it all back, willingly. Going back to being the family's punching bag because, as she explains to Brian, that is the role she serves in the household's ecosystem. In the purgatory theory, this ending is not a failure of the writers. It is a depiction of how unlearned the lesson still is. Meg offered them the clearest possible opportunity to be redeemed, and every single member of the family walked right past it. They are no closer to getting out of where they are than they were when they arrived. The show's increasing cruelty, in this framework, is not a sign of creative decline. It is a mirror. The longer these characters fail to learn, the worse their situation gets. Because purgatory is not a static state, it responds to the moral progress or regress of the people within it. The more Peter chooses selfishness, the more his world closes in around him. The more Brian chooses arrogance, the more humiliated he becomes. The more the family chooses to abuse Meg, the more the pressure builds on all of them. And Quahog itself, the town, the physical space they all inhabit, is the mechanism. It is not a real place. It never was. It is a constructed environment designed to test the people who have been placed inside it, and it will keep going, keep cycling, keep resetting, until they finally figure out what it is asking of them, or until it decides that they never will. Section 6. Meg Griffin knows everything. There is a theory about Meg that is much simpler and much stranger than the purgatory framework, and it begins with a single observation. Meg is the only character on the show who is consistently shown to have accurate perceptions of what is happening around her. Peter misreads situations constantly. Brian is so caught up in his own self-image that he regularly fails to see obvious truths. Stewie operates within his own elaborate internal framework that keeps him at a remove from the ordinary texture of daily life. Chris is oblivious in the particular, gentle way of someone who is simply not paying close enough attention to the world to form accurate conclusions about it. Lois is managing too many things simultaneously to look carefully at any one of them, but Meg sees things. She notices when something is wrong. She understands the dynamics of the family in ways that the family itself does not. In the few episodes that actually give her meaningful screen time and treat her as a real character rather than a target, she demonstrates a capacity for emotional intelligence and situational awareness that puts her ahead of everyone else in the household by a considerable margin. The theory about Meg knowing everything comes in two primary variants, and they are worth examining separately. The first variant is the simpler one. Meg is aware that she is in a television show. This theory is built on the way Meg responds to the abuse directed at her. She does not fight back. With a few notable exceptions, she does not try to leave. She does not escalate. She absorbs what is directed at her and continues to function. The theory suggests that this is because Meg has access to information that the other characters do not. She knows that the situation is not real, or at least not real in the way that the other characters experience it as real. She knows that the cruelty aimed at her serves a narrative function and that resisting it would disrupt something that is, on some level, supposed to be happening. She is not passive because she lacks agency. She is passive because she understands the structure she is living in and has made a calculated decision to fulfill her role within it. The evidence for this includes moments scattered throughout the show where Meg breaks from her usual characterization in ways that suggest a different kind of awareness. There are episodes where she directly addresses the camera or where she says things that seem designed for an audience rather than for the characters around her. There are moments where her reaction to situations is so precisely calibrated, so perfectly calibrated to produce a specific emotional response in the viewer that it feels less like a character responding organically to her circumstances and more like someone who knows what the scene requires and is delivering it deliberately. The second variant is more specific and more uncomfortable, the theory that Meg is Stewie's mother. This one has an actual in-show anchor. In the Season 8 episode Partial Terms of Endearment, an episode that Fox refused to air in the United States during its original broadcast, only airing it in the UK and eventually releasing it on DVD in America, Lois mentions Meg giving birth to Stewie. It is presented as a throwaway joke. Lois waves it off almost immediately. The characters move on, but the theory says that moment was not a joke. It was a disclosure that the show stepped back from because the implications were too significant to pursue at the time. The theory constructs a backstory. Meg, in whatever existed before the current narrative, before the family's current configuration, before the purgatory or the mental institution or the simulation, depending on which framework you prefer, was Stewie's biological mother. She was very young. Something happened that resulted in Stewie being raised as her sibling rather than her son. The memory of this was suppressed or erased, and the current family structure exists as a consequence of that concealment. This would explain several things about the Stewie-Meg dynamic that do not have obvious explanations otherwise. It would explain why Stewie, who regards virtually everyone around him with some degree of contempt, treats Meg with a particular flavor of disdain that feels personal rather than general. He is not just dismissing an annoying older sister, he is dismissing someone whose relationship to him is something he cannot consciously access, but whose presence produces a specific kind of discomfort that ordinary contempt does not fully account for. It would also explain one of the most emotionally interesting aspects of Stewie's character in the later seasons, his intense, almost desperate attachment to Brian. The theory suggests that Stewie latched onto Brian as a surrogate parental figure precisely because the relationship with his actual mother Meg has been hidden from him. His need for a stable, caring attachment to an adult figure is not being met by Lois, who he spent the early seasons trying to murder, or by Peter, who is too chaotic to provide reliable nurturing. It is being met, imperfectly and often dysfunctionally, by Brian. And the depth of that attachment, the way Stewie traveled through time to save Brian's life after his death, the way episodes devoted to the Brian-Stewie bond contain the show's most genuinely emotional moments, reflects a need that the theory traces back to something that happened before the story we are watching began. There is a third element of the Meg theory that exists in the space between the two variants described above. It is the question of why the show corrected course in its treatment of Meg around seasons 14 and 15, pulling back from the abuse storyline and beginning to give her episodes where she was competent, resilient, and occasionally even triumphant. The official explanation, widely reported, is that more women were added to the writing staff and pushed back against the cruelty directed at the show's primary female teenager. The theory community offers a different explanation. The narrative was correcting itself. Whatever force or consciousness or process generated the show's reality was adjusting the treatment of Meg because the treatment had gone too far, had pushed past the point of serving a narrative function, and had become something else. Something that the logic of the world could not sustain indefinitely. Meg's rehabilitation in the later seasons, in this reading, is not a creative decision made in a writer's room. It is the story doing what stories do when they have been mishandled for too long, finding their way back to something closer to right. Whether Meg knows all of this, whether she is aware of the correction happening around her, whether she has always been the most perceptive person in the room, the theory leaves these questions open. But it insists on one thing: the girl in the pink hat, the one that everyone treats as the least significant person in every room she walks into, is the person who understands what is happening most clearly of anyone. She always has been. She is just not telling anyone. Section 7. The American Dad Simulation Theory. At some point in the later seasons of American Dad, Steve Smith sits down in front of his family's television and watches an episode of Family Guy. This is played as a meta-joke, the kind of self-referential humor that both shows engage in periodically. But the fan theory community treated it as something much more significant, because it raised a question that the show had not considered. If the characters of American Dad can watch Family Guy as a television program, what does that mean for the relationship between these two fictional universes? The theory that emerged from that question is one of the most elaborate and far-reaching in the entire body of Family Guy fan speculation. It goes by several names, but its central claim is this: Family Guy is not a show that exists in the same universe as American Dad. Family Guy is a show that exists within the American Dad universe. The events that take place in Quahog are not happening in a real place, they are happening on a screen, in the world where the Smiths live, being consumed as entertainment the same way that the show's actual audience consumes them. This would make the Griffin family not characters in a coexisting fictional reality, but fictional characters within a fictional reality, which is a significantly different thing. The evidence assembled for this theory is substantial. Multiple characters in American Dad have referenced Family Guy as a piece of entertainment they engage with. Steve has watched it. Roger, the alien who lives in the Smiths' attic, has dressed up as Stewie for Halloween. Roger has mentioned being a fan of the show, which implies a level of sustained engagement with the material rather than a single passing reference. If these were just meta jokes, you would expect them to be inconsistent, the show acknowledging the gag and moving on. But the references are consistent enough and specific enough to suggest that in the world of American Dad, Family Guy is a genuine cultural artifact that characters have opinions about and relationships to. The crossover episode between the two shows adds another dimension. In a Season 8 American Dad episode, the Griffins and the Smiths appear in the same narrative. Characters from both worlds interact directly. The episode is played largely for absurdist humor and does not resolve the question of how these two universes are supposed to coexist. But the fan theory uses it as evidence that there is a point of contact between the worlds, a membrane through which the fiction of one can become temporarily real in the context of the other. There is also the question of Steve Smith himself. Steve is the teenage son of Stan and Francine Smith. He is academically inclined, socially awkward, intensely interested in science fiction and fantasy, and he does not look particularly like either of his parents. A fan theory from a now-deleted Reddit account made an observation that generated considerable discussion. Steve Smith looks more like the Griffin family than like the Smiths. Specifically, he shares certain physical characteristics, the hair, the chin line, certain facial proportions with Peter Griffin, and he shares nose structure and coloring with Lois Griffin. The theory built on this observation proposed that Steve Smith is a Griffin child who was either given up by the Griffins or taken from them under circumstances the show has never explained. The fact that the two shows exist in a connected universe makes this at least theoretically possible. The fact that none of the other Smith children resemble Stan the way Steve does not reinforces the suggestion that Steve's biological origins are somewhere else. And the fact that Peter and Lois have never definitively been established as incapable of having more children than the three we see in the show leaves the question open. If Steve is a Griffin, then the relationship between the two shows is not just creative, it is familial. The Smiths are raising a Griffin. The family that is the subject of the television show being watched in the American Dad universe is the biological family of one of the American Dad universe's actual residents. That is a recursion so elaborate that it requires a moment to fully appreciate. The deepest version of the American Dad simulation theory goes one step further, and this is where it becomes genuinely vertiginous. According to this version, Family Guy is not simply a television show in the American Dad universe. It is a government program. The Smith family patriarch, Stan Smith, works for the CIA. The CIA in the McFarlane universe is an organization that has demonstrated, repeatedly and within the canon of American Dad, a willingness to engage in projects of extraordinary ethical ambiguity, including the insertion of human brains into animal bodies, as established with Klaus the goldfish. The theory suggests that what the audience is watching in Family Guy is a CIA simulation, an experiment in contained reality, generating a population of subjects who live in an artificial environment for purposes that have never been revealed. This would explain everything about Quahog's fundamental wrongness. The rules do not work correctly because they were designed by people, not by nature. The characters cannot truly leave because the simulation has boundaries. The world resets between episodes because the operators of the experiment need to control the variables. The characters cannot age normally because the simulation is managing their biological state to keep the experiment running. In this framework, the Griffins are not characters in a story. They are subjects in a study. Whatever the CIA is learning from watching them cycle through the same dysfunctions over and over again, the experiment is still ongoing. The reset button gets pushed not because the story requires it, but because the researchers need one more repetition, one more data point, one more opportunity to observe how these particular people respond to these particular conditions. And if Steve Smith is a Griffin who somehow ended up outside the simulation, that makes him the most interesting character in the entire McFarlane universe. A subject who escaped, who is living in the world of the people running the experiment, and who watches the show about his biological family the same way the real audience watches it from outside, unable to intervene, unable to explain to the people on screen what they are actually in? There is a version of this theory that goes one level higher, which is the version where all of it, American Dad, Family Guy, The Cleveland Show, The Orville, every story Seth MacFarlane has ever told is a simulation within a simulation within a simulation, levels of nested fiction going down as far as you care to follow them. But that version makes the head spin in ways that are not especially productive. So we will leave it at the level where the Griffins are CIA test subjects and Steve Smith might be one of their kids. What the American Dad theory ultimately does, better than any of the others, is make explicit the question that underlies all Family Guy conspiracy theories. What is this world for? If it is not a real place, if it is not an organic narrative growing from real human experience, if it is a construction, whose construction is it, and why did someone build it? That question does not have an answer that the show is ever going to provide. But the asking of it is its own kind of pleasure. Late at night, when the story is still running, and the characters are still going through their loops, and the world outside the screen is quiet enough to hear your own thoughts. Section 8. Seth MacFarlane, the man who predicted too much. On the morning of the 11th of September 2001, Seth MacFarlane was scheduled to board American Airlines Flight 1, one at Logan International Airport in Boston. His travel agent had given him the wrong departure time. She told him the flight left at 8:15 inches the morning. The actual departure time was 7:45. MacFarlane arrived late, still dealing with a hangover from the night before, and reached the gate to find that it had already closed. He missed the plane by approximately 10 minutes. American Airlines Flight 1 was hijacked by terrorists and flown into the North Tower of the World Trade Center at 8:46 inches the morning. Everyone on board was killed. MacFarlane went to the airport lounge and fell asleep. He woke up to the commotion of people watching the news. He learned that the flight he had just missed had killed everyone aboard. His assistant, who had not received MacFarlane's message that he was taking a different flight, spent 20 minutes believing he had died. MacFarlane has spoken about this experience numerous times since. He is characteristically measured about it. He does not frame it in fatalistic terms, does not position it as destiny or miracle, tends instead to contextualize it as one of the many close calls that happen to people without their awareness all the time, only made visible by the magnitude of what it was a close call with. In a 2004 interview with the New York Times, he said there are probably 100 close calls every year that people never know about because the alternate outcome never happens. This was the one time the alternate outcome happened on a scale large enough that it was impossible to ignore. But the fan theory community has found in that morning something more than a story about luck and gratitude. They have found it the beginning of a pattern. The theory goes like this. Seth MacFarlane, whether consciously or unconsciously, has been processing events before they happen, events that he should have no knowledge of through the stories he puts into Family Guy. The shows he creates have, on multiple documented occasions, depicted situations, technologies, social trends, or specific events that subsequently occurred in the real world. The frequency and specificity of these coincidences is high enough, the theory argues, to suggest that something more is happening than the standard explanation of writers being observant about cultural trends and extrapolating logically from them. The list of Family Guy predictions that came true is long enough to be genuinely striking. In a 2009 episode titled 420, Brian leads a campaign to legalize cannabis in the show's fictional Rhode Island town. The episode depicts the legalization passing, citizens buying and using the substance legally, productivity rising, and crime falling. 13 years later, in 2022, the real state of Rhode Island legalized cannabis for recreational use. The show, set in Rhode Island, depicted the legalization of cannabis in Rhode Island roughly a decade before the real legalization. An episode that aired in 2012 depicted Caitlyn Jenner, referred to at the time as Brody Jenner's parent, with reference to gender that strongly implied foreknowledge of a transition that Caitlyn would not publicly discuss until 2015. The theory suggests this was an open secret in entertainment industry circles that MacFarlane was privy to, which is a reasonable explanation. But the specificity of the reference still makes it unusual. A Family Guy cutaway involving Barry Manilow in which a gag implied something about his orientation aired several years before Manilow publicly came out as gay in 2017. Again, possibly an open secret. Possibly industry gossip that filtered into the writing, but notable. A Season 8 episode depicted a newscaster being compared to Charlie Rose, with the implication that Rose was an alcoholic who behaved badly in professional settings. When Charlie Rose became one of the most prominent figures affected by the Me Too movement in 2017, many fans revisited the episode. An episode in which the Griffin family deals with a prostate exam gone wrong, leading to a lawsuit against the family doctor, aired years before a real medical case involving a prostate exam lawsuit became a notable news story. The show's episode, Peter Griffin, husband, father, brother, in Season 2, referenced the family doctor Hartman performing an inappropriate exam, and the specific dynamic of that scene, the doctor's cavalier attitude, the violation of the patient's dignity, the legal aftermath resembled the structure of real cases that followed. The death of Brian Griffin in the fall of 2013 coincided within the same week with the real death of Fast and Furious actor Paul Walker in a car accident. Both involved a character named Brian dying in a vehicle-related accident within days of each other. The coincidence was widely noted on social media at the time. The theory's most discussed example, though, is the one that relates directly to September 11th. In 2000, a year before the attacks, Family Guy aired an episode called Road to Rhode Island, which contained a scene in which Stewie and Brian are at an airport and encounter a situation involving airport security and a flight. The episode does not predict the attacks in any meaningful way. But the theory community has always been more interested in a later piece of media, the direct-to-DVD movie Stewie Griffin, The Untold Story, which was released in 2005. In that film, Stewie has a near-death experience involving a lifeguard tower that he has rigged to explode. The tower falls. Stewie later goes back in time to prevent it from happening. In the film's climax, as Stewie succeeds in preventing the explosion, he shouts, "Yes, I did it! I stopped the tower from falling!" A tower stopped from falling by a character who is, in the context of the fan theory about the show's relationship to its creator, a version of Seth MacFarlane processed through fiction. The theory proposes that the film was MacFarlane's way of working through the guilt and the dissonance of having survived something that killed hundreds of people he did not know and could not save. He survived because he was late. He could not go back, but Stewie could. And in the world of the show, the version of September 11th that MacFarlane was supposed to be present for could be undone. The character who represents the creator's internal life could go back, could fix it, could be the one who stopped the tower from falling instead of the one who stumbled away from it because he drank too much the night before and his travel agent wrote down the wrong time. This reading is not something MacFarlane has ever confirmed or denied. He tends to discuss his near miss with September 11th in practical, grounded terms, and he has been careful not to let the narrative of his survival overshadow the much larger tragedy of everyone who did not survive. But the pattern of the film, the tower, the explosion, the time travel to prevent the disaster, the triumphant declaration that the tower has been stopped from falling is specific enough that the theory has always had more traction than most. What does it mean if Family Guy is actually predictive? If the stories MacFarlane tells contain information about events that have not happened yet? One answer is that it means nothing interesting that any creative person working at scale, producing hundreds of hours of content over decades about contemporary culture, will occasionally hit on something that resembles a future event by simple probability. There are enough predictions that did not come true to fill several additional lists. The show does not have a track record of reliable prophecy. It has a track record of producing enough material that some of it coincidentally resembles things that later happened. But the other answer, the answer the theory prefers, is that MacFarlane is more attuned to the ambient signal of the culture than most people, and that his shows function as a kind of cultural EKG, detecting the tremors of events that have not yet broken the surface of the present moment. Not supernatural foreknowledge, something more subtle and more interesting. The ability to notice what is already moving in the dark before most people can see it? If that is true, then every episode of Family Guy is worth watching twice. Once for what it says, once for what it might be saying about something that has not happened yet. Section 9. The Giant Chicken, the Mayor, and the Hidden Mythology of Quahog. There is a character in Family Guy who appears periodically, with no more warning than a sudden burst of action music, to engage Peter Griffin in a fight that generally lasts for several minutes, destroys significant portions of the physical environment of Quahog, and ends with one or both combatants in a state that would, in any realistic context, result in hospitalization and several criminal charges. The character is Ernie the Giant Chicken. His first appearance was in the Season 2 episode Da Boom, where his origin was established. Ernie gave Peter a coupon that turned out to be expired. Peter was humiliated by this experience, and rather than simply being annoyed about the coupon and moving on with his life, Peter initiated a conflict that escalated into a full-scale physical confrontation from which neither man has ever fully recovered. The fights between Peter and Ernie are among the show's most distinctive and most technically accomplished sequences. They are elaborately choreographed, frequently parodying the style of action movies, and they continue across multiple seasons with no indication that the underlying conflict has been resolved or that either combatant has developed any new information about why they are doing this. The fan theory about Ernie the Giant Chicken is one of the oldest and most debated in the Family Guy theory community, and it comes in two primary forms. The first form is relatively simple. Ernie is not an ordinary oversized chicken. He is a government operative, specifically a CIA asset, assigned to monitor Peter Griffin and periodically provoke him in order to collect behavioral data. The expired coupon was not a genuine mistake. It was a test. The fight it triggered was the intended outcome. Every subsequent encounter is another test, a controlled assessment of how Peter responds to escalating conflict, extreme physical stress, and the kind of sustained adversarial relationship that most people would have resolved through legal or social channels long before it reached the stage of destroying downtown buildings. This theory connects naturally to the American Dad simulation framework. If Quahog is a CIA experiment, Ernie is one of the experiment's most visible elements, an artificially introduced stressor, a recurring variable in the experiment's design. The fights are not random. They are data collection events. The fact that Peter and Ernie always end up in a kind of impasse, neither one winning decisively, neither one dying, the conflict never truly resolving, is not a comedic choice. It is the experiment's design feature. The stressor is supposed to recur. The response is supposed to be measured repeatedly across different contexts and different intervals. The second form of the Ernie theory is darker and stranger. It suggests that Ernie is not a chicken at all. He is a human being who has been surgically altered to look like a chicken, perhaps by the same process that put a human brain into the body of Klaus, the goldfish. The theory notes that Ernie's wife, whom Peter meets in a later episode, and with whom the Griffins have a cordial relationship, is a normal-sized human woman. The couple's domestic life, the brief glimpses the show provides of it, is indistinguishable from that of any other couple in the neighborhood. Ernie has a career, a home, a marriage. He participates in ordinary social activities when he is not fighting Peter. The only abnormal thing about him is his size and his appearance, and both of those, in the context of the Brian as transplanted human theory, could be the result of a medical intervention gone wrong or deliberately applied. If Ernie is a human in a genetically or surgically altered body, then his rage toward Peter takes on a different character. He is not a chicken with a grudge. He is a person with a grudge, who happens to be unable to resolve it through normal human channels because the body he is in prevents him from being recognized as a person. The expired coupon incident in this reading was not a petty commercial transaction. It was a moment of humiliation inflicted on someone who has already lost everything that made him recognizable as human, and Peter's refusal to even acknowledge the slight was the last straw. Mayor Adam West is a separate but related element of the show's hidden mythology. The mayor of Quahog, played in the original run by the late Adam West himself, was one of the show's most consistently funny recurring characters, a man who behaved in ways that suggested profound mental instability, saying and doing things that had no apparent connection to rational motivation, treating the municipal government of a Rhode Island city as his personal playground for elaborate and inexplicable schemes. The show played Mayor West as simply deranged. His behavior was the joke. His lack of connection to normal social reality was presented as a kind of pure absurdism, divorced from explanation or context. But a Season 13 episode changed the calculus on that reading entirely. In a therapy session, Mayor West's doctor, who turns out to be Cleveland Brown, offers his diagnosis of the mayor's behavior. Cleveland suggests that Mayor West is not actually deranged. He knows exactly what he is doing. He is fully aware of every bizarre and apparently irrational act he has ever committed. The apparent madness is a performance, a carefully constructed persona designed to make him impossible to predict or hold accountable. Mayor West confirms this directly. He admits it. And then he goes further, confessing to Cleveland that he has also killed people, multiple people. The implication being that the strategic insanity has been a cover for conduct that goes well beyond political eccentricity. This episode effectively retroactively reframes every Mayor West moment in the entire run of the show. Every joke that seemed to be about his mental instability is now, potentially, a joke about his deliberate deception. Every absurd decision he made as mayor, the ones that seemed like punchlines to a joke about incompetent governance, might have been precisely calculated moves, the real purposes of which were hidden behind the performance of madness. The fan theory built on this revelation goes further than the episode itself does. It proposes that Mayor West's long tenure in Quahog politics is connected to the city's fundamental wrongness. He has been the mayor for the entire run of the show. He has presided over all of it: the giant chicken fights, the alien invasions, the Y2K nuclear catastrophe, the multiple near destructions of the town, the ongoing experiments on the citizenry. He has never been voted out, never been effectively challenged, never faced meaningful consequences for any of his decisions. If Quahog is a simulation or an experiment, the mayor is the interface. He is the character who occupies the position of nominal authority over the constructed environment, and whose behavior chaotic, unpredictable, impossible to challenge serves to prevent the residents from organizing any effective response to the conditions they are living in. You cannot build a coherent movement against an authority that makes no coherent decisions. You cannot hold accountable a mayor who is never coherent enough to be accountable for anything specific. The madness is not a personal failing. It is a management strategy. The founding mythology of Quahog, established through Griffin Peterson, the ancestor who won the town in a musical contest after being exiled from England, adds the final layer. The Griffins have been associated with this place since its founding. Peter is not just a resident of Quahog. He is descended from the man who created it. Whatever is wrong with this place is, in some meaningful sense, his family's responsibility. This gives the Peter is in a mental institution theory a resonance it would not otherwise have. The world inside his head is not just any constructed reality. It is the specific place his family comes from. He is not imagining a generic suburban America. He is imagining home. He is imagining the place where his ancestor planted something, a piece of exiled English history, a musical rivalry, a love story that required an ocean crossing to resolve, and where the consequences of that planting have been playing out across centuries, building toward whatever is happening now. The giant chicken and the pretend crazy mayor and the founding contest and the broken water and the simulation and the purgatory and the dead family and the author who drinks too much to keep the story straight, they are all part of the same mythology. A mythology about a place that should not exist, populated by people who should not be there, telling a story that should have ended long ago but somehow keeps going. They are all, in the end, theories about the same thing, about why a story keeps running past the point where it should have found its resolution, about what it means to live inside a loop and not quite know that you are in one. Section 10. The finale that never came. What it all means. Family Guy will not end. That much is now effectively official. In April 2025, it was announced that the show had secured a renewal deal with its parent company Disney that will take it through season 27 and the 2028 to 2029 television season, a broadcast calendar that happens to coincide with the show's 30th anniversary. Each season under the new deal will consist of 15 episodes. The show has outlasted every reasonable expectation for its longevity, having survived 2 cancellations and then continued for more than 2 decades beyond its revival. It will now almost certainly reach its 3rd decade on the air. The fan theory community has always had an intense relationship with the question of how Family Guy would end, partly because the show itself has been so aggressively non-committal about its own continuity, and partly because the theories that have been developed about the show tend to generate their own implied endings. Each major theory contains, embedded within it, a vision of what a finale would look like if the theory were true, and many of those implied finales are significantly more emotionally resonant than anything the show has produced in its later seasons. The Peter is in a mental institution theory implies a finale in which Peter, after some unknowable number of loops, finally lets go. He stops fighting the grief. He allows the people he has been keeping alive in his imagination to die the death they already died. Cleveland and Quagmire come to visit him for what feels like the last time. The screen inside Peter's head goes dark, and what we are left with is the question of whether the darkness is an ending or whether it is, at last, the beginning of something else. The Stewie controls time theory implies a finale in which Stewie, finally, does not reach for the reset. Brian grows old, Brian dies, and Stewie allows it to happen. He sits with the grief instead of erasing it. He lets time move in the direction time is supposed to move. And in doing so, he becomes something he has never been in all the countless loops he has engineered. Older, not old, necessarily, but moving forward rather than circling back. The Brian is the author theory implies a finale in which Brian finishes his novel. Not the self-help book, not the play, not any of the other projects he has started and abandoned across the seasons. The real novel, the one that has always been called Faster Than the Speed of Love, the one the show treats as his endless failure. The theory says the novel is Family Guy, that the thing Brian has been writing all along is the show that has contained him, and when he finishes it, the show ends. The author completes the work. The last page turns. The characters he has been developing across 2 decades of narrative finally do what characters do at the end of a well-told story. They arrive somewhere. They know something at the end that they did not know at the beginning. The purgatory theory implies a finale that the show has been building toward since the first episode, even if it has never said so, a moment when one of the characters actually learns their lesson. The theory tends to focus on Stewie as the most likely candidate, given the evidence that his arc in the later seasons represents genuine moral development. The finale, in this reading, would be Stewie's release his graduation from the state of suspended punishment into whatever comes after. Whether the rest of the characters follow, or whether they keep cycling through their loops without him, is left ambiguous. The Meg knows everything theory implies the most unusual possible finale, one told from Meg's point of view. In all the thousands of minutes of this show, Meg has almost never been the protagonist of her own story. The theory has always argued that she sees more clearly than anyone else in the frame. A finale from her perspective would be the most radical departure in the show's history. A story told by the character who has been treated as the most disposable, whose knowledge of what is actually happening has been the show's longest and least acknowledged secret. These finales will never happen. The show will not end in any of these ways. It will run through its 27th season, and it will probably be renewed again after that, and the characters will continue to cycle through their loops for as long as the business mathematics of animated television justifies the continuation. Seth MacFarlane has said that the show has reached what he called escape velocity, that it has been going long enough that there is no obvious reason to stop, and that it continues to generate revenue that supports causes he cares about. These are honest reasons. They are also exactly the kinds of reasons that a story's author gives when the story has outlasted the creative vision that originally generated it. The show keeps going not because there is more to say, but because the machinery of its continuation is still functional, and stopping a functional machine requires a deliberate choice that nobody currently in a position to make that choice has any incentive to make. But the theories persist. They persist because they have something the official story currently lacks, a sense of shape, a sense that all of these characters and all of these situations and all of these years of accumulated incident are pointing towards something. That the chaos is organized, that the pain has a purpose, that the cruelty is not arbitrary but is the expression of something that could, if the right conditions arose, resolve into understanding. Fan theories about Family Guy are, ultimately, acts of care. They are what happens when an audience loves something enough to want more from it than it is giving them to want the randomness to have meaning, to want the characters to matter in ways the show itself has stopped insisting they do. The people who develop these theories watch the show carefully enough to see its structures and its patterns and its repetitions, and they used what they saw to build something that the show itself has never quite provided. A mythology, a reason for all of it. The water in Quahog is wrong. The timeline is broken. The father is dreaming in a hospital bed. The baby created the universe. The dog wrote the story. The family is dead and working towards something they cannot name. The mayor is pretending. The chicken has a human soul. The quiet girl in the pink hat knows everything and is waiting. These are not just theories. They are the shape of grief for a show that once meant something and is still, in its best moments, capable of meaning something again. They are the audience doing what audiences do when a story runs longer than its own logic can sustain, filling the silence with meaning, making the incomprehensible cohere, finding the heart in something that has spent years pretending it does not have one. Maybe the show will end someday. Maybe season 30 will be the last. Maybe someone in a writer's room will decide that enough has been said and that the kindest thing to do for these characters is to finally let them arrive somewhere. Until then, the lights stay on in Quahog. The Drunken Clam is open. The Griffin House sits on Spooner Street with its improbable layout and its broken physics and its residents who love each other badly and cannot stop. And somewhere in the space between the story and the theories about it, in the quiet place where what is shown and what is imagined meet, something is still trying to become whatever it was always supposed to be. The baby in the yellow shirt is not done yet, and neither are any of the rest of them. That is every conspiracy, every theory, every hidden layer and dark corner of the Griffin universe that the internet has assembled over 25 years of watching this show closely enough to see what it might really be about. If any of these theories change the way you think about what you have been watching, or if there is one we missed that you think deserves to be here, the comment section is waiting for you. Drop your thoughts down below. And if you have been resting here through all of this, come back anytime. There will always be more stories to tell in the dark. If you got something out of this, please subscribe. It genuinely makes a difference. Thank you for being here. End of script. Section 1 expanded. The architecture of a town that rewrites itself. Let us go deeper into the texture of Quahog itself, because the place deserves more attention than it typically receives in these discussions. Most fan analyses of Family Guy focus on the characters. The setting tends to get treated as backdrop, as context, as the environment through which the characters move rather than as a character in its own right. But Quahog is not merely a backdrop. It is an active participant in everything that happens within it. Consider the geography. Spooner Street, where the Griffins live, exists in a neighborhood whose spatial relationships are demonstrably inconsistent across episodes. The Swanson house is sometimes directly adjacent to the Griffin house, and sometimes separated by a noticeable gap. The Brown house, when Cleveland was still a regular presence, moved at least once between seasons without any explanation being offered. The Drunken Clam has been shown from the outside in configurations that cannot all be simultaneously true. Its entrance, its relationship to neighboring buildings, and its interior dimensions shift in ways that suggest either that the same building is being remembered differently by different people, or that the building itself is not entirely fixed in the way that ordinary buildings are fixed. This is more than the kind of casual inconsistency that any long-running animated show accumulates over time. Springfield in The Simpsons famously has a geography that makes no coherent sense, but Springfield's inconsistency feels like indifference. Quahog's inconsistency has a different quality. It feels deliberate, or at least purposeful in some sense that indifference cannot account for. The theory community has developed a specific framework for understanding this. The town's physical space responds to the emotional state of the person observing it. When Peter is in crisis, the distance between his house and the places he needs to reach expands. When Peter is comfortable, the town arranges itself conveniently around him. The bar is never more than a short walk away when he wants a beer. The grocery store is difficult to find when Lois sends him there for something she actually needs. The town accommodates Peter's desires and resists his responsibilities, which in the mental institution theory is perfectly logical. It is his mind, and his mind will naturally configure the space to serve his fantasy rather than to make the practical demands of adult life easier to navigate. There is a specific location within the Griffin house that the theory community has spent considerable time analyzing: the basement. The basement appears in various episodes with wildly different configurations. In some episodes, it is a small, cluttered storage space of the kind you would expect in a lower middle-class Rhode Island home. In others, it opens into something much larger, containing facilities, rooms, and spaces that could not physically exist within the footprint of the house above it. Stewie's room has been established as containing weapon workshops, laboratories, and technical facilities that similarly cannot coexist with the ordinary domestic space the house otherwise appears to occupy. The room is sometimes the size of a modest child's bedroom, and sometimes the size of an industrial workshop, depending on what Stewie needs in a given episode. The theorist consensus is divided. One school of thought holds that the house exists in a space not constrained by the laws of physics that normally govern the relationship between interior and exterior dimensions, which is either a consequence of Stewie's technological interventions or a feature of the simulated environment the CIA has constructed. Another holds that the variability of the house's interior is evidence that what we are seeing is not a single consistent location but a series of memory reconstructions, each episode's depiction of the house being drawn from a different moment in Peter's recollection, with inconsistencies reflecting the natural variability of remembered spaces. Either reading deepens the theory. If the house is a physics-defying structure, that tells you something about the nature of the world it exists in. If the house is a memory, that tells you something about the nature of the person remembering it. There is also the question of what happens to the town between episodes. Within the world of the show, the town has been significantly or entirely destroyed on multiple occasions. The Season 2 episode, Da Boom, depicts a Y2K nuclear catastrophe that leaves the town in ruins. The episode ends with a Dallas-style reveal that the entire thing was a dream, but the fan theory community has always been suspicious of that framing. The narrative acknowledgement that it was a dream feels slightly forced, like a late addition rather than an organic part of the story. And the consequences of that episode seem to bleed into subsequent stories in ways that suggest something real happened there that the show chose to partially disavow rather than fully commit to. The Peter versus giant chicken fights have destroyed significant portions of downtown in virtually every appearance. Buildings reduced to rubble, infrastructure demolished, explosions reshaping entire city blocks, and yet, the following episode, everything is back. The buildings stand, the streets are clear. No insurance claims, no construction crews, no acknowledgement that anything happened. The theory about this is not that the show simply does not care about continuity. The theory is that the town has a regenerative capacity, and that this capacity is a feature of whatever it actually is. If it is a simulation, the simulation resets environmental damage between sessions. If it is a purgatorial construction, the physical environment reconstitutes itself, because it is not actually physical. If it is Peter's mind, the world his mind has created cannot remain permanently destroyed, because the point of the creation is to maintain a livable version of the life he has lost, and a destroyed city does not serve that purpose. The founding mythology of the town, established through Griffin Peterson, adds the final structural layer to this understanding. The name Griffin Peterson is a puzzle that functions as a key. Griffin is the family name of the show's protagonists. Peterson means, in its most literal sense, son of Peter. The man who founded the town was, nominally and linguistically, a griffin who was the son of someone named Peter. The founder and the protagonist are connected not just by ancestry but by name, and the town that the Griffins call home was founded by a version of the main character who came before the main character. Griffin Peterson was exiled from England. The show has never fully explained why. The exile is presented as a given, a historical fact about the town's founding that does not require elaboration. But the fan theory community has spent considerable time with the question of what crime or disgrace was sufficient to force someone out of their country of origin in the 17th century. The theories range from the political to the personal to the strange. Some versions suggest that Griffin Peterson was exiled for the same kind of reckless, consequence-free behavior that characterizes Peter Griffin, that the family's tendency towards spectacular and ungovernable disaster is a genetic inheritance present in the bloodline since the 17th century, reshaping itself into new forms in each generation. Other versions suggest something less common, that Griffin Peterson's exile was not punishment for a crime, but extraction from a situation that someone needed him removed from. That the New World was not a place he was sent to as penalty, but a place he was sent to as protection, or as purpose, or as the beginning of a project that would take centuries to reach the stage we are watching now. The musical contest through which Peterson won governance of the settlement is the detail that most rewards attention. A singing contest. A man who was exiled from England won the right to govern a new settlement because he could sing better than whoever he was competing against. This is how authority is established in myths. In stories where the world is arranged to give a specific person what they need, regardless of conventional qualification, where the structure of the contest is designed to produce a predetermined result. The chicken fights, in this deepest mythology layer, are not about a coupon. They are about something in the character of the Griffin line that has been in conflict with something outside itself since the 17th century, a conflict imported to the New World along with the family that carries it, playing out in various forms ever since. And Mayor West is the current form of whoever lost the singing contest to Griffin Peterson in the 17th century, not literally the same person, but genealogically and symbolically the inheritor of that displacement, trying to reclaim what the founder of the bloodline took from whoever came before. The Griffin family founded this place. The town is, in some essential sense, theirs. And every episode is a continuation of a story that began centuries ago. Every conflict is an echo. Every reset is the town attempting to return to a moment before the exile, before the journey, before whatever happened that set the Griffin line in motion and has kept it moving ever since. Section 2 expanded. The interior world and its decay. The mental institution theory gains additional precision when you examine what Peter's constructed world reveals about his psychological state at specific points across the narrative. The early seasons of the show are characterized by warmth. The Griffins fight and make up. Peter messes up and apologizes. The family's love for each other is expressed imperfectly but recognizably. The theory reads this warmth as the quality of Peter's grief in its early stages fresh enough that the love still dominates, that the world he is building is still largely shaped by his desire to recreate what he had, rather than his resentment at having lost it. As the seasons progress and the warmth drains away, the theory maps this to a specific psychological phenomenon. The way that grief, when it goes unprocessed for too long, curdles into something harder and more defensive. Peter cannot mourn his family openly because to mourn them would be to acknowledge they are gone, and the entire structure of his interior world is built on the premise that they are not. So the grief gets no outlet. It circulates and accumulates and slowly changes the texture of the world he is generating. The love becomes resentment. The warmth becomes cruelty. The family that was supposed to be a refuge becomes a pressure point. The specific escalation of Peter's treatment of Meg across the seasons is, in the theory's framework, the clearest diagnostic signal of his deterioration. In the early seasons, his treatment of her is thoughtless rather than deliberate, the inattention of a man who is absorbed in his own anxieties and does not notice the effect he is having on the people around him. By the middle seasons, it has become something more active, more directed, more charged with the specific emotional weight of resentment that cannot be named. By the later seasons, it is almost entirely unmediated. The resentment has no distance left in it. It has become reflex. The theory notes that this pattern tracks with what is understood about grief in prolonged pathological states. The initial stage of denial maintains the warmth because it requires the world to feel real, to feel like the people in it are genuinely the people they are supposed to be. But as the denial becomes harder to maintain as the weight of reality keeps pressing against the constructed world, the defenses become more aggressive. There are moments, scattered throughout the series, where Peter's real self breaks through the constructed character. Episodes where he is tender with Lois in a way that has no comedic purpose and serves no plot function, pure expressions of the love that underlies everything. Episodes where he sits quietly with one of his children and the silence between them has an emotional quality that the show's usual chaos cannot account for. These moments are not inconsistencies in the characterization. They are the man in the hospital bed surfacing, briefly, to the memory of who he was before everything went wrong. The theory also addresses the recurring presence of death in the show, not as a permanent narrative state, but as a recurring event that is always reversed. Characters die with unusual frequency across the run of the show, and they almost always come back. This is not lazy writing, the theory says. This is the mind of a grieving man constructing a world where things can always be fixed, where the worst outcomes can always be reversed, where the people he loves never have to stay dead. When Stewie uses his time machine to bring Brian back, that moment is not a narrative convenience. It is the show's most direct depiction of what Peter's mind is actually doing, reaching back into time and undoing a loss because the loss cannot be survived. The time machine is not science fiction in this reading. It is grief. It is the mechanism of denial given a mechanical form and placed in the hands of an infant, so that Peter can watch it work without having to acknowledge that it is him who is operating it. The show did not change its use of cutaway gags because the writers became lazier. The show changed because the mind generating it is working harder to maintain coherence and failing more often. The early seasons, when Peter's grip was tighter, have fewer and shorter cutaways. The later seasons, when the construction is beginning to come apart, are dominated by them. The randomness is not a stylistic choice. It is what an exhausted mind produces when the effort of sustained, coherent narrative exceeds its current capacity. Section 3 expanded. The loop that never closes. The de-aging theory requires one further extension to be fully understood. The question of what happens at the moment of reset. When Stewie uses his memory-erasing device on the family, the Men in Black-style neutralizer, the theory posits he creates a specific kind of discontinuity in the world's timeline. The people he erases are not exactly the same people who existed before the erasure. They are rebuilt from Stewie's memories of them, which are themselves incomplete and partial, and colored by his own interpretive framework. The Lois who exists after a reset is Stewie's reconstruction of Lois, based on how Stewie has experienced her. The Peter who exists after a reset is Stewie's reconstruction of Peter. Even Brian, the one person whose memories Stewie typically preserves alongside his own, is subtly different after each reset because he is experiencing the same world from a slightly altered context each time. Over enough resets, these accumulated differences in reconstruction add up. The characters we are watching in Season 20 are not the same people who appeared in Season 1. Not because of organic growth or change, there has been almost none of that, but because they have been rebuilt enough times that small errors in reconstruction have compounded. Certain qualities have been amplified by Stewie's unconscious preferences. Others have been diminished. The Peter of the early seasons is Stewie's reconstruction of a man he knew when his own psychology was different. The Peter of the later seasons is Stewie's reconstruction of a man he knows now, filtered through whatever changes have happened to Stewie himself across all those loops. This is why Peter becomes crueler. Stewie has become, over the accumulated weight of all those loops, a being who is more accustomed to cruelty than he once was, more numbed to it, more likely to reconstruct the world's cruelties as normal rather than as aberrations. His own sensitivity has worn down, and his reconstructions of the people around him reflect that wearing. The de-aging theory, taken to its conclusion, says that the show we are watching is not a story about people. It is a story about Stewie's memories of people, repeated and refined and degraded across an indeterminate number of iterations. The real Peter, the real Lois, the real Chris and Meg, they have not existed in their original form for a very long time. What exists now are the echoes of those people, filtered through the mind of a baby who has been running the universe since before the universe began, and who is too exhausted and too attached to let it stop. And Brian, the one person whose memories mostly survive each reset alongside Stewie's own, is also the one person who is most visibly degraded by the process. Because preserving someone's memories across a reset does not mean preserving their essential self. It means giving them access to the accumulated weight of all the loops they have lived through without the cushioning of forgetting. Brian knows, in some inaccessible part of himself, that he has been through this before. He cannot articulate it, he cannot name it, but he carries it, loop after loop, and it is making him worse. Not crueler exactly, but more desperate, more self-serving, more willing to take shortcuts because the shortcuts have always been there, and taking them has never, in any of the loops, made things significantly worse. The theory notes that this explains Brian's seemingly inexplicable oscillation between his good and bad selves. In the moments when he is kind and thoughtful and genuinely caring, he is accessing a version of himself that predates the loops, a memory of who he was before the accumulation. In the moments when he is cruel and selfish and hypocritical, he is living in the accumulated damage of having been through too many iterations of this story. Both versions are real, both are him. The question of which one shows up in any given episode is a question of which layer of his memory is closest to the surface on that particular day. Section 4 expanded. Brian, Klaus, and the Brotherhood of Displaced Minds. The parallel between Brian and Klaus is worth dwelling on at length, because the more carefully you examine it, the more specific and meaningful it becomes. Klaus Heisler, before the CIA put his brain in a goldfish, was a West German Olympic ski jumper who competed at the 1986 Winter Games in Calgary. He was, by every account the show gives, a person of remarkable physical gifts and considerable ambition. He was taken from that life and placed in a body that had no physical gifts at all, and no ability to express ambition in any way that the world around him was equipped to recognize. His wife and family in Germany presumably had to be told something that he died, that he disappeared, that he was simply gone. The CIA does not explain itself to the families of its subjects. What the show depicts of Klaus's existence in the Smith household is a person who has made a kind of functional peace with a life he did not choose. He is funny, he has opinions, he participates in the dynamics of the household with something approaching genuine investment. But underneath all of that is the persistent awareness of loss of the life he had, the body he was born into, the future he was supposed to have. The show treats this mostly as comedy, but it treats it consistently, which means the loss never quite goes away. Brian's situation, if the transplant theory is correct, is structurally identical to Klaus's but played in a different key. Klaus knows exactly what happened to him. He knows he was a ski jumper. He knows his brain is in a fish. The awareness of the discontinuity is constant and explicit. Brian, if the theory is right, does not have that clarity. Whatever Brian was before he was, Brian has been obscured by the same procedure that placed his consciousness in the dog's body. The operation erased not just his original life, but his memory of having had one. He does not know he was a person. He only knows that he is something stranger than a dog, something more than what he appears to be, and that the world consistently fails to recognize him as whatever that something is. This is a more insidious loss than Klaus's. Klaus grieves a life he remembers. Brian grieves something he cannot name or locate. He reaches for sophistication, for literature, for the trappings of an intellectual life, because something in him remembers that these things were his, but he cannot access the memory clearly enough to know why. He falls in love with human women because something in him remembers being the kind of entity that forms relationships with human women. He keeps a gun because something in him has experienced a level of despair that precedes his current existence and that he cannot fully account for in the context of the life he currently has. The theory suggests that Brian's alcoholism and drug use are, in part, attempts to access the blocked memories, not consciously. He does not sit down with a martini and think, perhaps this will help me remember who I was. But the substances produce the kind of cognitive loosening that, in someone with buried memories, occasionally allows fragments to surface. And when fragments surface, they create the specific kind of confusion and sadness and inexplicable longing that Brian exhibits in the show's most emotionally honest moments. The feeling of having lost something he cannot quite identify, of reaching for a self that exists just outside the boundary of what he can access. The episode Brian and Stewie, which is the show's most celebrated depiction of Brian's inner life, has Brian revealing that he keeps a gun for moments when the despair becomes too much. In the context of the transplant theory, this revelation is about something larger than alcoholism and depression. It is about the specific unbearability of being a mind in the wrong body, of having lost everything that defined you as yourself without even being able to remember what you lost. The grief that does not know what it is grieving for is in some ways the worst kind. At least Klaus can say specifically what he misses. Brian cannot. What Brian has instead of his memories is Stewie. The relationship that has become the emotional center of the show's later seasons is, in the theory's framework, not just a friendship between a dog and a baby. It is the one relationship in Brian's existence that asks nothing of him except that he be present. Stewie does not care that Brian is a dog. Stewie does not need Brian to be anything other than what he currently is. And for a consciousness that has lost the entire context in which it was previously housed, that unconditional acceptance is more valuable than anything else the world of the show contains. Brian stays for Stewie, not just because of loyalty or affection, though those are real. He stays because Stewie is the only entity in the world who makes his current existence feel worth inhabiting. Section 5 expanded, The Sins and Their Weights. The purgatory theory, at its most granular, involves a careful accounting of what each character did before they arrived in Quahog, and why that history generates the specific form of punishment they are currently experiencing. The most fully developed version of this mapping goes character by character through the main cast and their recurring secondary characters. Peter's sin, as noted in the overview section, was a specific kind of thoughtless cruelty, the cruelty of someone who never paid enough attention to notice the harm he was causing. But the theory extends this further. Peter's cruelty was concentrated on the members of his own family, on the people who were most dependent on him and least able to leave. He used the authority of fatherhood and marriage as a shield that protected him from the consequences of his behavior. The purgatorial response places him in a family where his authority is consistently challenged, where his behavior has consequences he cannot entirely avoid, and where the people he thought he could treat as subordinates are fully capable of giving back what he gave them. The particular cruelty of Peter's purgatory is that the family he has been placed with would be genuinely worth loving if he were capable of seeing them clearly. Lois is intelligent and capable and loyal in the face of consistent provocation. Brian is perceptive and occasionally wise. Even Meg, who is the direct object of most of his worst behavior, is a person of genuine emotional intelligence and quiet strength. The test is not whether Peter can love people who are easy to love. The test is whether he can love people who are real complicated, flawed, not the simplified versions of people that his previous life allowed him to demand. He has not passed that test. He keeps simplifying them. He keeps reducing them to the most convenient version of themselves, the version that makes the least demands on his attention and his conscience. The test keeps running. Lois's sin, in the theory's most common version, involves a particular form of vanity that expressed itself through social performance rather than through direct cruelty. She was, the theory suggests, a woman who was very good at appearing to be better than she was, who maintained a public persona of warmth and competence and moral clarity that did not fully correspond to the private reality of how she treated the people around her. She was skilled at being seen as the reasonable one, the patient one, the one who kept things together, in a way that allowed her to avoid accountability for the ways in which she failed. Her purgatory places her in a family where she cannot maintain that persona. The chaos is too great and too constant. Nobody in her household is impressed by the performance of competence because the household is perpetually in a state where competence is visibly failing to produce the outcomes it is supposed to produce. She cannot be the person who keeps things together because things cannot be kept together. And the deeper failure, the ways in which her private behavior toward her family has always fallen short of the public version, is constantly exposed by the specifics of how the family dynamic plays out. The theory's treatment of Joe Swanson is worth examining here, because Joe represents a specific kind of complication for the purgatory framework. Joe, by every observable measure, is the character in the main cast who is most clearly trying to be good. He is devoted to his wife and his family. He takes his responsibilities seriously. He maintains his dignity in circumstances that would be demoralizing for most people. He is, in the show's own terms, better than the people around him in most of the ways that the purgatory theory suggests the characters are being measured on. And yet Joe's situation in the show is not better than the others. His wife falls out of love with him. His friends mock him. His disability is used as a punchline more frequently than the show's early depiction of it would have suggested. If purgatory is a place where you get what you deserve, what did Joe do to deserve this? The theory has two responses. The more straightforward one is that Joe's suffering is not punitive, but instructive in a different way. He is being tested on his ability to maintain goodness in conditions that make goodness difficult rather than on his ability to become good in the first place. The harder test is the sustaining one, not the initial achievement. The more complicated response suggests that Joe's apparent goodness conceals something the show has never directly addressed, a history of using his disability strategically, of allowing others to lower their expectations of him, and then benefiting from those lowered expectations in ways that are not quite honest. Neither response is fully satisfying, which is part of what makes the theory alive rather than closed. The best theories are the ones that generate new questions at the edges of the answers they provide. Section 6 expanded. The other characters who know. The theory that certain characters have a meta-awareness of their situation in the show is not limited to Meg, though Meg is its most developed case. There are several other characters whose behavior, looked at through this lens, suggests an awareness that the official narrative does not acknowledge. Stewie obviously knows the most. His knowledge of the nature of the world he inhabits is not theorized but canonical. He built the time machine, he has traveled to multiple timelines, he has experienced the world from outside the space-time continuum and been present for the creation of the universe. He knows that the world is stranger than it appears. What he does not know is the full scope of what his own interventions have done to it. Brian, in the theory that he is the author of the show, also has a form of meta-awareness, though his is less clear than Stewie's. He knows he is writing something. He knows the world around him has a constructed quality. He does not necessarily know that the construction is his own, or that the characters he is generating are versions of real people who no longer exist. The more interesting cases are the characters who seem to have awareness without any obvious in-story mechanism for how they got it. Cleveland Brown is the most discussed of these. When Cleveland appeared in Family Guy, he was consistently one of the most grounded and observationally accurate characters in the show, the one who could look at a situation and describe it with precision that the others lacked. His move to his own spin-off series was portrayed within the show as a voluntary departure, a man choosing to start a new chapter. The Peter in the hospital theory says Cleveland left the show because visiting Peter was affecting his grip on reality. But there is a version of the theory that suggests Cleveland himself has an awareness of the constructed nature of the world he is inhabiting, and that his departure was a calculated withdrawal from a situation that he understood more clearly than he was supposed to. Within the Cleveland show, Cleveland occasionally makes references to his previous life in a way that could be read as the references of a man who knows he has left one story and entered another. The new show around him is different from the world of the Griffins, in ways that go beyond geography. It has a different emotional texture, a different relationship to consequence, a different level of warmth. These differences could be attributed to different writing staffs and different creative intentions. The theory says they could also be attributed to a character who understood what the previous world was and made a choice about how much of that world he wanted to bring with him. The character of Bonnie Swanson, Joe's wife, is a more subtle case. Bonnie spent approximately 8 seasons of the show pregnant, a time frame that is biologically impossible but that the show never addressed as unusual. She was simply perpetually pregnant, season after season, until the writers eventually resolved the storyline and she gave birth to a daughter. The theory community has interpreted this extended pregnancy as evidence that Bonnie has a different relationship to time than the other characters, that she exists in a temporal state that does not correspond to the ordinary flow of time in the world around her. And the question of why she exists in that state, and who or what is responsible for it, has generated a minor sub-theory about Bonnie's role in the broader structure of the world. The most common version suggests that Bonnie's pregnancy is being sustained by an external force, that someone or something is preventing the birth from occurring because the birth, when it happens, will shift the dynamics of the neighborhood in ways that are not yet ready to be shifted. The baby inside her is a variable that has been held in reserve, a change that the world is not yet ready to absorb. And when the birth finally happens, the change it represents is the beginning of a cascade that the theory has not fully tracked. Section 7 expanded. The deeper architecture of the crossover. The American Dad simulation theory gains additional depth when you consider the specific mechanism by which the simulation is supposed to operate. If Quahog is a CIA experiment, it is not a passive one. The CIA, in the McFarlane universe, does not simply set up an environment and observe what happens. It intervenes. It introduces variables. It adjusts conditions based on the data it is collecting. The show's internal evidence supports this. The world of Quahog changes in ways that are not driven by the choices of its inhabitants, that arrive from outside the narrative as shifts in the environment rather than as consequences of specific character decisions. Characters lose jobs and gain jobs without clear causal connections to their previous choices. Financial situations fluctuate in ways that do not correspond to any economic logic the show maintains. The town's institutions, the police department, the school, the hospital, behave with a consistency toward the Griffin family that goes beyond what ordinary institutions would maintain, as though they have been specifically configured to interact with this family in particular ways. The theory says this is because they have been. The CIA does not leave the variables of its experiment to chance. The families and institutions and individuals that surround the Griffins are not simply neighbors and coworkers and authorities going about their own lives. They are elements of a constructed environment, each one placed in proximity to the subject family for specific reasons, each one serving a function in the overall experimental design. This reading makes almost every recurring secondary character in the show a potential asset or operative rather than an independent civilian. Quagmire, whose extreme and apparently guilt-free sexual behavior would be impossible to sustain in any ordinary social environment without significant legal and social consequences, is a man whose continued presence in the neighborhood suggests either that he has protection from the normal consequences of his choices or that his choices are somehow useful to the experiment. Tom Tucker, whose career as a news anchor survives scandals that would end any real journalist's employment, similarly suggests a level of institutional protection that goes beyond ordinary resilience. The most interesting case in this extended version of the theory is Herbert the Old Man. Herbert's behavior toward children is depicted throughout the show with a consistency and an openness that would, in any real community, have attracted attention and intervention long before the events of any given episode. The theory notes that Herbert has operated without consequence for the entire run of the show, that his victims have consistently been protected by circumstances rather than by active adult intervention, and that his presence in the neighborhood, so obviously wrong by any reasonable standard, has never been addressed in a way that would result in his removal from it. If Quahog is a CIA experiment, Herbert is either a variable that the experiment is deliberately maintaining, or he is something even stranger, a subject of his own supplementary study, an element of the environment that the experiment's designers place there for reasons that have to do with the larger question they are investigating about human attachment, human failure, and human survival in environments that are not safe. The theory does not conclude anything definitive about Herbert's role. It only notes that his sustained presence in an otherwise monitored environment is one of the most significant anomalies the simulation theory is capable of generating, and that any complete accounting of what Quahog actually is would need to address it. Section 8 expanded. The year the show became prophetic. The theory about Family Guy's real-world predictions is most compelling when you examine not individual instances, but the cumulative pattern that emerges when you lay all the instances side by side. What the pattern reveals is not random distribution across topics and timeframes. The predictions cluster around specific subject areas. They cluster around the entertainment industry and its concealed behaviors. They cluster around shifts in social and legal norms related to substances and personal freedoms. They cluster around political figures and their private contradictions of their public positions. And they cluster notably around events involving cars and sudden deaths. The entertainment industry cluster is the most extensive. The Kevin Spacey implication, the Barry Manilow implication, several other jokes involving celebrities whose private realities became public in the years following the episodes that referenced them. The theory suggests that this cluster reflects MacFarlane's position within the industry, that he is part of a social world where information about powerful people circulates at a level that is not accessible to the general public, and that his shows occasionally encode that information in ways that seem like jokes until the information becomes public. The social norm cluster is different in character. Rhode Island cannabis legalization, various shifts in how American society talks about gender and identity. The gradual normalization of things that the show depicted as transgressive at the time of their depiction. These are not industry gossip. These are observations about the direction of cultural change, delivered with enough lead time to feel like prediction. The theory suggests that this reflects MacFarlane's specific kind of intelligence, his ability to identify which social changes are already underway, already inevitable, already being driven by forces that will not be stopped, and to depict their arrival before they have fully arrived. The car cluster is the strangest of the three, and the theory treats it with the most care. Brian's death by car coinciding with Paul Walker's death by car. Various other vehicular moments in the show that preceded real vehicular events by months or years. The theory does not know what to make of this cluster. It notes it. It documents it. It does not attempt to explain it, because the explanation that would fit that MacFarlane has some kind of access to knowledge about future vehicle-related deaths is too far outside the bounds of what the theory is willing to claim. The car cluster is the raw data for which the theory has no framework. It sits at the edge of the ledger, unexplained, waiting for a reading that has not arrived. The September 11th entry remains the anchor of the entire prophecy framework, not because it is a prediction, but because it is a displacement. McFarlane was removed from the timeline of that event by 10 minutes. He was supposed to be on the plane. He was not. And the subsequent years of his creative output have been shaped in ways that may be impossible to fully disentangle by that removal. The Tower episode is not a prediction, it is a wish. It is what the mind of a man who barely missed a catastrophe does. When it is given a canvas large enough to express itself, it creates a version of the event in which the catastrophe is undone by someone quick enough and capable. Enough and in possession of the right technology. Stewie stopped the tower from falling. Seth MacFarlane missed the plane by 10 minutes. These two facts live in the same imaginative space. They are not the same fact. But they are not entirely separate ones either. Section 9 expanded. The chicken fights as ritual. The Ernie the Giant chicken fights have a structure that is so consistent across their many iterations that it is worth mapping them precisely. The introduction. Peter and Ernie encounter each other in an ordinary context. A street, a store, a gas station. There is a moment of recognition. The moment is always the same. Both combatants register the other's presence. There is a pause, and then the violence begins. The pause is the most interesting part. It is the moment where both parties could choose not to do this. Every time, they choose to do it anyway. The escalation. The violence moves from ordinary fighting to something increasingly cinematic, increasingly elaborate, increasingly impossible to survive in any realistic sense. The show parodies action movie conventions with increasing precision as the fights extend. The choreography becomes more complex. The stakes become more absurd. Buildings fall. Vehicles are destroyed. The city absorbs damage that would realistically close it for months. The resolution. Both parties reach a point of simultaneous incapacitation. Not one winning and one losing. Not one dead and one surviving. Both down, both apparently finished, both recovered in time for the next encounter. The resolution is always a draw. The draw is always total. There is never a partial win, never a situation where Peter or Ernie emerges with a meaningful advantage that carries forward to the next encounter. The reset. The following episode, both parties function as normal. No injuries, no legal consequences, no social acknowledgement of what just happened. The fight did not count. The draw did not mean anything. The next time they meet, the encounter will begin from exactly the same starting position it always begins from. This is the structure of a ritual, not the structure of a conflict. A conflict moves. A conflict accumulates consequences. A conflict changes the relationship between the parties, pushes it toward resolution, generates information about which party is stronger or more capable or more determined. This does not. Every chicken fight produces exactly the same result, a draw. The parties are exactly as matched after the fight as they were before it. Nothing has been learned. Nothing has been decided. The ritual has been performed. The next performance will begin when the conditions require it. The question that a ritual structure raises is, what is the ritual for? Every ritual serves a function, marks a boundary, renews a covenant, confirms a relationship. The chicken fight ritual, if it is a ritual, is doing one of these things every time it occurs. The theory has an answer. It is confirming that the balance between the Griffin line and whatever Ernie represents has not been disturbed. It is a periodic check on the stability of the arrangement that has governed this town since its founding. Peter and Ernie fight because the arrangement requires them to fight, because the fighting is how the arrangement demonstrates its continued validity, and because a world in which Peter and Ernie did not fight would be a world in which something fundamental about Quahog had changed. The fights are not conflicts, they are maintenance. Final section, the last theory, and the first light. Every theory in this script has been, at its core, a theory about why something does not change. Peter does not change. Brian does not change. Stewie is prevented from changing by the necessity of the loop. Meg is prevented from changing by the family that needs her to stay as she is. The town does not change because it regenerates itself after every destruction. The show does not change because the business reasons for its continuation outweigh the creative reasons for its evolution. The fan theories are all, in some sense, explanations for a world that is stuck, They are attempts to understand why a thing that should be moving is not moving, and to find in that stillness some shape or purpose rather than mere entropy. And what they find across all their different frameworks and all their different conclusions is the same thing, that what looks like being stuck is actually something more complicated. That what looks like repetition is actually something more like endurance. That the family on Spooner Street, dysfunctional and cruel and incapable of sustained growth, though they may be, keep coming back to each other because there is something in them that has not given up, even when every other part of them seems to have. The conspiracy theories about Family Guy are love letters. They are written in the language of paranoia and mythology, addressed to a show that has not always deserved them, sent by people who remember something they saw in the early seasons and have been trying to find again ever since. Something about a family that meant well in a world that was already wrong. Something about people who loved each other imperfectly and did not stop. The world of Quahog is wrong from the beginning. The timeline is broken. The rules do not apply. The people within it are haunted by things they cannot name and weighted by histories they cannot access. None of this is going to be resolved. The show will not end cleanly or wisely. The characters will not be given the grace of a final understanding. But they will be there, next Wednesday night, or whenever the next episode airs, on whatever streaming platform you find them on. In the house, on the street, in the town that should not exist. Doing the things they have always done, failing the tests they have always failed. Occasionally, briefly, for just long enough to recognize it, being exactly who they were always supposed to be. The baby in the yellow shirt is still going. The lights are still on. Come back anytime. Thank you for being here for all of this. Every single one of these theories was built by someone who loved something enough to think hard about what it might mean. There is nothing more human than that. Subscribe if you want more of this kind of thing. Leave a comment if something here stayed with you. And rest well, wherever you are watching from tonight. Good night. Deep Dive, The Quagmire Problem. Glenn Quagmire is one of the 4 members of the friend group that orbits the Griffin household, and of all of them, he is the one whose characterization contains the most unresolved contradictions. On the surface, Quagmire is a sex-obsessed airline pilot whose entire personality is organized around the pursuit of women. He is crude and unashamed about it. His catchphrases are about it. His house is designed around it. His entire social identity is built on it. The show treats this as a comic trait, an exaggerated version of male sexual appetite pushed past the point of comedy into something that the show acknowledges occasionally is disturbing. But underneath the comedic surface, Quagmire has a history that does not fit with the one-dimensional characterization. In later seasons, it is revealed that his sister is in an abusive relationship and that this affects him deeply. It is revealed that he had a daughter he did not know about. It is revealed that his father is a transgender woman, and that his initial response to this goes through genuine psychological complexity before arriving at a fractured kind of acceptance. These are not the biographical details of a cartoon sex pest. These are the details of someone whose relationship to intimacy, to gender, to family, and to his own desires has been shaped by experiences more complicated than the surface of his character acknowledges. The fan theory about Quagmire is one of the oldest and most straightforward in the show's theory community. He is not human. Specifically, the theory proposes that Quagmire is an incubus, a supernatural creature from folklore whose nature is defined by sexual compulsion, and whose existence depends on the energy generated by that compulsion. The evidence cited includes the impossibility of his sexual career by any normal human standard, the fact that he consistently avoids the consequences that would normally follow from behavior as extreme as his, and the way that the women who encounter him rarely seem to retain clear memories of what happened in the way that they would if the encounters were ordinary. The incubus theory connects to the purgatory framework in a specific way. If the town is a purgatorial construction, then every element of it serves a purpose in the testing of the characters who have been placed within it. Quagmire's role, as an incubus or something functionally similar to one, would be to embody the temptation of consequence-free desire, to be present in Peter's life as an example of what it would look like to pursue pleasure without restraint, without consideration for the people affected, without the weight of responsibility. The fact that Peter repeatedly finds this lifestyle appealing, repeatedly tries to participate in it, repeatedly discovers that it does not produce the satisfaction it promises, is the test. The test is whether Peter can see through the appeal of consequence-free desire to something more durable and honest. He has not passed that test either. But Quagmire keeps embodying the temptation, season after season, and the test keeps being offered. The theory has an extension that addresses Quagmire's speech in the episode Jerome is the New Black, in which he tells Brian exactly why he dislikes him. The monologue is precise and devastating, naming the specific ways Brian's self-presentation diverges from Brian's actual behavior with a clarity that goes beyond what ordinary social perception would be capable of. An incubus, in the folkloric tradition, can see through the social performances that humans construct around their desires. It can identify the gap between what people claim to want and what they actually want. Quagmire's speech to Brian is not the speech of a sex-obsessed pilot who happened to notice something. It is the speech of something that has perceptual access to the gap between presentation and reality, delivered with the precision that access makes possible. Whether you take the incubus reading literally or metaphorically, what the theory ultimately says about Quagmire is that his character contains information about the world of the show that the surface of his characterization obscures. He is not just a joke about male sexuality. He is a structural element of the test, a recurring temptation with specific perceptual gifts, and the fact that he has lived next door to Peter Griffin for 25 years without either of them fully understanding the other is itself a kind of commentary on the nature of the relationships within which we spend our common lives. Deep Dive: The Cleveland Show and What Peter's Mind Did with Loss. When Cleveland Brown departed Family Guy for his own spin-off series in 2009, the official reason given was that the character deserved his own vehicle, his own storylines, his own space to develop in ways that the ensemble format could not fully accommodate. The fan theory community received this departure differently. In the Peter in the Hospital theory, Cleveland's departure from the main show represents a specific development in Peter's psychological state. The point at which one of the people who was keeping him company in his deterioration began to recognize what the companionship was doing to them and made the choice to step back. The theory notes that the world of The Cleveland Show is different from the world of Family Guy in ways that go beyond the obvious differences of setting and cast. The Cleveland Show has a different emotional texture. It is warmer, more grounded, more interested in the consequences of the choices its characters make. The humor is softer. The family dynamics, while still comedic, are more concerned with genuine connection and less with the elaborate dysfunction that defines the Griffin household. Cleveland in his own show is not the same Cleveland who appeared in Quahog. He is more capable, more present, more fully himself. The theory says this is because the Cleveland of The Cleveland Show is not being filtered through Peter's mind. He is being depicted as he actually is, rather than as Peter remembers him. The real Cleveland, visiting Peter in the facility, is a man of considerable warmth and emotional intelligence. The Cleveland who appeared in Family Guy was Peter's version of Cleveland, affable, loyal, somewhat hapless, existing primarily in relation to Peter's needs rather than his own. When Cleveland stopped visiting, when he withdrew from the role of participant in Peter's interior world, The Cleveland Show gave the audience a glimpse of who Cleveland actually was when he was not being defined by his proximity to Peter's grief. The Cleveland Show ended in 2013 after 4 seasons. The theory community notes that Cleveland's return to the main show after the end of his own series corresponds in the Peter framework to a resumption of visits. Cleveland came back. He had stepped back for a few years, had given himself some distance, had tried to live his own life independent of the role he was playing in Peter's imagined world, and then he came back. Because you cannot stay away forever from someone who is in that much pain. You cannot sustain the distance in the face of something that continuous and that fundamental. Cleveland came back and the show absorbed him back into its ensemble, and the family on Spooner Street continued as it had continued before his absence. Nothing was acknowledged. Nothing was addressed. The departure and the return were treated as simply things that had happened, without significance beyond the narrative facts of them. But in the theory, they are enormously significant. They are evidence that the people who care about Peter are themselves affected by the depth of the contact. They come, they try. They sometimes step back when the effect on them becomes too great, and they come back because they love him, because the love does not go away even when the situation is too heavy to carry comfortably. The pity and the love and the exhaustion that Cleveland feels, in the theory's framework, are the most human things in the entire story. A man visiting his friend in a hospital, year after year, maintaining a connection to a person who can no longer fully see him as he actually is, who keeps showing up, because what else do you do when someone you care about is suffering? And the suffering has no clear end. Deep dive. What happens to the real Meg? The theory that the family's reality is a construction, whether Peter's mind, a CIA simulation, or a purgatorial environment, has a specific implication for Meg's real-world counterpart that the theories rarely address directly. If what we are seeing in Family Guy is a version of a real family, then somewhere outside the constructed version there is an actual Meg. And the actual Meg, in the theories that posit a real world from which the construction is derived, is not who the show depicts. In the mental institution theory, the real Meg is the most straightforwardly tragic figure in the entire story. She was a popular, beautiful teenager who was driving her brother to a party, who had been drinking, who got into an accident that killed her brother, and set in motion the chain of events that destroyed her family. She died in that accident. She is not alive anywhere. The Meg who exists in the show is Peter's reconstruction of her, distorted by resentment into something unrecognizable, made ugly and unwanted in his imagined world, because he cannot make himself love her fully while also blaming her. The real Meg loved her brother. She was trying to include him in her social world, to give him an experience she thought would be good for him. She made a terrible mistake. She died for it. And in the mind of the father who survived her, she was remade into something that could bear the weight of his anger, remade into a version of herself that seemed to deserve what came to her. This is the most heartbreaking element of the theory when you sit with it. Peter's treatment of Meg in the show is not just cruelty, it is the processing of grief that has nowhere else to go. He cannot be angry at a dead daughter for the thing that killed her. The anger has to go somewhere. So it goes into the constructed version of her, the one who lives in his mind and cannot die again, the one who keeps existing precisely so that the anger has a target. And the real Meg, in whatever reality exists outside Peter's mind, is just gone. She was a teenage girl who made a mistake and died for it. She deserved better than to be the target of her father's imagined cruelty for 2.5 decades. She deserved better than what the show gave her, even in the seasons when the abuse was at its peak. The real her is beyond all of it, unreachable, preserved in the brief and ordinary life she actually lived before everything went wrong. This is why in the late seasons, when the show began to treat Meg more compassionately, the change feels like more than a creative correction. It feels, in the theory's framework, like Peter beginning to mourn her properly, beginning to see her clearly, in the way that grief sometimes allows eventually, not as the target of the anger, but as the person he lost. Not as the ugly, unwanted daughter of his imagined world, but as the beautiful girl who loved her brother and died, trying to help him feel included. The compassion toward Meg in the later seasons is not the writers fixing a mistake. It is a father beginning, slowly, to forgive. Deep dive. The show that ends before it ends. Every long-running television show has a moment where it ends emotionally before it ends literally. The characters stop developing. The stories stop surprising. The world stops feeling alive in the way it felt alive in the seasons when everything was new and nothing was settled. The official end, when it eventually comes, is not the real end. The real end happened earlier, quietly, in some episode that nobody marked as significant at the time. The fan theory community has argued extensively about when Family Guy's emotional end occurred, and the answers vary depending on which framework you use to evaluate it. The creative quality peak was almost certainly in the first 3 seasons, before the original cancellation. Those seasons have the tightest writing, the most coherent character dynamics, the warmest emotional texture, and the most disciplined use of the show's distinctive humor. They are what the show was when someone cared most intensely about what it was. The emotional peak, the moment when the show most fully expressed its own deepest potential, is harder to identify. The theory community tends to point to 2 episodes that both aired well into the show's post-revival run, but that represents something like what the show could be when it was being honest, rather than just being entertaining. The first is Brian and Stewie from Season 8, in which Brian and Stewie are locked in a bank vault and forced to talk to each other. There are no cutaways. There is no subplot. 2 characters with a genuine relationship say things to each other that are true. The episode is quiet and strange and entirely unlike anything else the show has produced, and it is, in the opinion of a significant portion of the show's most devoted fans, the best single episode in the entire run. The second is Life of Brian and its follow-up, Christmas Guy, taken together. Brian's death and Stewie's rescue mission contain an emotional honesty about loss, about attachment, about the specific panic that comes from realizing that someone you took for granted might actually be gone, that the show has rarely matched before or since. The moment when Stewie sees his past self buying the time machine toy in the mall and realizes there is a way back is one of the most genuinely moving things the show has ever put on screen. Both of these moments are, in the various theories frameworks, moments when the show touched something real beneath its constructed surface. Brian and Stewie is Brian the author putting down his pen and speaking directly, without the mediation of the narrative around him. Christmas Guy is Stewie the loop runner breaking from his pattern, not because a plan has succeeded, but because grief found a loophole, because love is more persistent than even the most determined attempt at resignation. The emotional end of the show, the moment when it stopped being able to produce moments like these with any consistency, is harder to date precisely. The theory community tends to place it somewhere around season 10 or 11, after which the emotional honesty became increasingly rare, and the moments that touched the real thing became more sporadic and more accidental than intentional. The show did not end at season 10. It continued, and will continue, for years more. But the version of Family Guy that could produce Brian and Stewie, or Christmas Guy, is harder to find in the episodes that came after. It is there, occasionally. A scene here, a moment there, a line reading that carries a quality the surrounding episode does not quite earn. The capacity is still present. It surfaces sometimes, like something that has been pressed down and keeps finding ways to come back up. The theories about the show are, in part, attempts to understand where that capacity went and whether it can be recovered. Whether the warmth and the honesty and the feeling that the characters matter are still in there somewhere, waiting for the right conditions to return. Whether the show that produced those moments is gone or just buried. The theories say it is buried. The real story, the true story, the one that the show has always been trying to tell, is still in there, covered by seasons of cutaway gags and flanderized characters and shock value and business decisions. But still in there. The baby in the yellow shirt has not finished yet. He has more loops to run, more chances to take. The ending is still out ahead of him somewhere, still possible, still the shape of something that has not yet been given its final form. And that is not nothing. In a world that resets as often as this one does, the fact that the ending has not been written is not a sign of failure. It is a sign that the story still has somewhere to go. The lights stay on in the town. They always have. The house on Spooner Street is still standing even after everything that has hit it. The people inside it are still, inexplicably, together. That is the real mystery of Family Guy. Not the time machine or the simulation or the purgatory or the hospital room. The real mystery is simpler and stranger than any of those things. Why do they keep coming back to each other? And why, after 25 years of watching them do it, do we keep coming back to watch? Rest well. We will be here when you come back. Final synthesis. Everything points to the same thing. When you lay every theory discussed in this script side by side and look at what they share, you find a single through line running through all of them. Every theory, without exception, is a theory about attachment. The mental institution theory is about a man so attached to the people he lost that he cannot let them go, even decades later, even from inside a constructed world that is slowly deteriorating around him. The Stewie de-aging theory is about a child so attached to his best friend that he has remade the entire timeline to keep him from aging. The purgatory theory is about characters whose primary failing is their inability to develop the kind of healthy, honest attachment that would allow them to truly love the people they are living with, rather than just tolerating them. The Brian as author theory is about a creator whose attachment to his own creation has blurred the line between the story and himself. The Meg theory is about a character whose attachment to a family that damages her is so fundamental that she chooses to absorb the damage rather than leave. The American Dad simulation is about a government trying to understand attachment by studying a family that cannot stop attaching to each other no matter what happens to them. Every theory is asking the same question in different terms. What is it that makes people stay? What is the mechanism of loyalty, of love, of the specific human stubbornness that keeps people bound to each other across years and decades, and all the accumulated damage that relationships produce. Family Guy, at its strangest and its most theorized and its most examined, is a show about that mechanism. It is a show about people who should leave and do not, about people who should grow and are prevented from doing so, about people who are terrible to each other and come back anyway, about the specific and irreducible quality of human attachment that persists even when every rational argument says it should not. The theories are just the audience articulating that question in the language of conspiracy and mythology, because the show itself has rarely been willing to articulate it directly. The show prefers to depict the attachment without naming it, to show the staying without explaining the stay. And the audience, encountering that choice year after year, has done what audiences do. It has built the explanation that the show declined to provide. This is what it means to love a piece of art enough to theorize about it. You are completing it. You are giving it the shape it reached for but never quite achieved. You are saying, I see what you were trying to do, and even if you did not fully manage to do it, I am going to imagine what it would look like if you had, and I am going to hold that imagined version alongside the actual one, and the two together are going to mean something that neither one could mean alone. That is the gift the theories give to the show. And the gift the show gives to the theories is the material to work with. 25 years of a family that cannot quite say what it means to each other, in a world that keeps resetting before the saying can be completed, watched by an audience that remembers what the show was when it was trying hardest to say something true. The loop keeps running. The baby holds the universe in place. The dog keeps writing. The girl in the pink hat keeps watching. The father in the hospital keeps dreaming. And somewhere in the space between all of that, the thing the show has always been reaching for is still there, still waiting, still possible. We will see you next time. Subscribe. It helps more than you know. And if you watch this all the way through, you already know why this channel exists. Thank you for being here. Extended. The hidden language of the cutaway. The cutaway gag is so fundamental to Family Guy that it is easy to forget how radical it was when the show first introduced it as a primary comedic technique. Other shows had used the device before, but none had made it so central, so frequent, and so structurally load-bearing. The show was, in a significant way, defined by this one technique. The theory community has spent considerable time analyzing not just the frequency and length of the cutaways, as discussed in the overview sections, but the content patterns within them. What subjects do the cutaways gravitate toward? What topics come up again and again? What does the aggregate of all the cutaway content say about the unconscious preoccupations of whoever is generating the narrative? The answer, when you lay the cutaway content out across seasons, is revealing. The cutaways cluster heavily around three subjects: nostalgia for the 1970s and 1980s, celebrity culture and its discontents, and failure. Not dramatic failure, not the failure that produces tragedy or character development, but the small, embarrassing, ongoing failure of a person who keeps trying things and keeps being reminded that their attempts are inadequate. The nostalgia cluster is the most discussed. Peter's cutaways frequently reference movies, television shows, and cultural moments from the decades before the show takes place. He is perpetually looking backward, perpetually finding the present inadequate compared to a past that the cutaways treat as both genuinely better and subtly ridiculous. The theory reads this as grief expressed through temporal displacement. You cannot get back to the people you have lost, but you can keep returning to the era when they were alive. The 1970s and 1980s cutaways are not really about those decades. They are about when Peter's life felt intact. The celebrity cluster is about something different. The cutaway gags involving celebrities tend to land on moments of humiliation, of gap between public image and private reality, of the specific quality of fame that makes the person famous less real rather than more real. The theory connects this to Brian's position as the author of the show. A writer's relationship to celebrity is often ambivalent at best. Brian is a failed writer who has spent his career watching people less talented than him achieve the cultural recognition he wanted. His cutaways about celebrities are the expression of that ambivalence, processed through the narrative he is generating. The failure cluster is the most significant in the theory's framework. The cutaways about people failing, about plans going wrong, about the specific comedy of inadequacy applied to ordinary human endeavors, are the dominant mode of the show's comedy across its entire run. And in the theory that the show is generated by Peter's mind as a way of maintaining the story of a life that has already ended, this dominance makes sense. A mind that is processing catastrophic loss will be preoccupied with failure. Not the failure that destroyed everything, which is too large and too direct to approach, but the small failures, the manageable ones, the ones that can be laughed at because they are not the one that cannot be laughed at. Every cutaway gag about someone failing at a minor task is, in this reading, Peter finding a way to practice the feeling of failure at a scale that does not break him. He is doing what people do with grief when it is too large to confront directly, approaching it sideways, finding the adjacent feeling, building up a tolerance for loss through repeated exposure to smaller versions of it. The show did not consciously design this pattern. It emerged from 25 years of generating content through a specific creative sensibility in a specific psychological state. But it is there, consistent across seasons, visible once you are looking for it. The cutaway gag is not laziness. It is displacement. Every time the show cuts away from the main narrative to show someone failing at something inconsequential, it is demonstrating the mechanism by which a mind under pressure manages contact with things it cannot fully bear to look at directly. Extended. The significance of the Griffin House layout. The house on Spooner Street has been depicted in so many different configurations across the show's run that a dedicated fan could spend considerable time mapping its inconsistencies without exhausting the material. The front of the house is relatively consistent. The white exterior, the green grass, the window arrangement that the show has used as an establishing shot for decades. But the interior is another matter entirely. Rooms shift, staircases appear and disappear. The bathroom exists in multiple locations depending on which episode you are watching. The attic has been depicted as both accessible and inaccessible in episodes that seem to take place in the same period of the family's life. The backyard's relationship to the houses on either side of it has been reconfigured multiple times. The theory community has produced several detailed analyses of these inconsistencies, and the conclusions they reach tend to cluster around two interpretations. The first interpretation, which we have touched on in other sections, is that the house is a memory reconstruction rather than a fixed physical space. Each episode depicts the house as Peter's mind currently configures it, and the configuration shifts based on which aspects of the house he is accessing from his recollection. Rooms that were important during specific periods of family life are more detailed and more consistently depicted in the episodes that correspond to those memories. Rooms that were less frequented appear in more variable configurations because the memory of them is less fully formed. The second interpretation, which is newer and less widely discussed, is that the house's layout inconsistencies are evidence of Stewie's de-aging interventions. Each time Stewie resets the timeline, the house is rebuilt from the memories of the people who inhabit it. And those memories, distributed across multiple consciousnesses, do not agree with each other about where everything is. Peter remembers the bathroom on the left side of the hallway. Lois remembers it on the right. Chris has no strong memory of the bathroom's location at all. The reconstruction averages these competing memories and produces a house that is somewhat different each time, as the weights assigned to different people's recollections shift with their current psychological states. This interpretation adds a domestic texture to the de-aging theory that makes it feel more lived in and more real. It is not just the broad strokes of the characters' lives that have been rebuilt by Stewie's interventions. It is the architecture of the space they inhabit. Every time the floor plan is slightly off, every time the staircase is in a location that does not match the previous episode's depiction, that is the seam showing. That is the evidence of a reconstruction that did not quite get everything right. The bedroom that Stewie inhabits is particularly interesting in this framework. It has been, as noted, depicted with a vastly different scale and content depending on what the episode requires. But it is also the room in the house that is most consistently Stewie's own, most consistently depicted as belonging to him in a way that transcends the inconsistencies that affect the rest of the house. Whatever else the de-aging device has reshuffled, Stewie's claim to his space has remained intact. The theory says this is because Stewie is the one running the reconstruction. The house is rebuilt according to everyone's memories, but Stewie's memories carry the most weight in the rebuilding. And Stewie, who has lived in his room through every loop, who has built his machines and his weapons and his time travel devices in that space across more iterations than anyone else can count, knows exactly what his room looks like. His reconstruction of it is more complete and more precise than anyone else's reconstruction of any other part of the house. The rest of the house is uncertain. Stewie's room is fixed. That asymmetry is not a coincidence. It is the map of where the power actually lives in this household. Extended. The final accounting. There are things about Family Guy that no theory has adequately explained, and listing them is part of being honest about the limits of what the theory community has achieved. No theory has fully accounted for the recurring presence of death and how the show uses it. Characters die with a frequency that would be extraordinary in any other context, and they come back with a consistency that the show has never explained. Brian's death and resurrection is the most dramatic instance, but Herbert, the elderly neighbor, has died and returned. Various minor characters have died in episodes and reappeared in subsequent seasons without acknowledgement. The show treats death as reversible except when it does not, and the exceptions are not patterned in any way that the theories have been able to map. No theory has fully accounted for the existence of death as a character. In the show, death is an actual entity with a personality, a social life, and a presence in the town. He has favorites among the cast. He is affected by the things that happen to him. He is, by all the evidence the show provides, a person in a very strange occupation rather than an abstraction or a force. What his existence implies about the nature of the world of the show is something none of the theories have directly addressed. If death is a character who can be befriended, challenged, and occasionally outwitted by the people in this world, then the relationship between that world and mortality is categorically different from the relationship between the real world and mortality, and the implications of that difference have never been fully followed. No theory has fully accounted for God. God appears in Family Guy multiple times as a character with specific preferences, behaviors, and a social life that includes dating and recreational activities. His existence as a character rather than a concept has implications for the purgatory theory that the theory never fully addresses. If God is a character in the world of the show, and purgatory is a theological concept that requires God's existence to make sense, then the purgatory theory is operating in a world that has confirmed its own theological premises. That confirmation should change something about how the theory works. It has not been adequately incorporated. No theory has fully accounted for the multiverse. The show has, in various episodes, established that the Griffin family exists in a universe that contains multiple alternate versions of itself. Stewie has visited parallel timelines. The show has depicted universes in which different choices produced different outcomes. The existence of the multiverse implies that every major theory about the show's true nature, rather than being mutually exclusive, might all be simultaneously true in different timelines. The mental institution theory might be true in one branch, the simulation theory in another, the purgatory theory in a third. And the version of the show that the audience has been watching might be the branch in which none of these things are definitively the case, and all of them are partially true, and the ambiguity is the point. That last possibility is the one the theory community has been most reluctant to embrace, because it seems to foreclose the satisfying resolution that theories promise. But it might be the most honest reading available. A show that has been running for 25 years and that has built a world as internally contradictory and as deliberately inconsistent as Family Guy's world is, might not have a single true explanation. It might be a thing that contains multiple true explanations simultaneously, each one valid for the aspect of the show it addresses and incompatible with the others, only if you insist on a kind of consistency that the show itself has never maintained. The theories are not wrong. They are, all of them, true in the ways they are able to be true, and the show is the space where all of them coexist, where the purgatory and the simulation and the hospital room and the author's desk and the baby's time machine are all real at once, none of them canceling the others, each one illuminating a different corner of the same enormous and inexplicable thing. That is what makes the show worth theorizing about. That is what makes 25 years of attention feel like something other than wasted time. The house on Spooner Street is still there. The family is still inside it. The loop is still running. And the people watching, the people who built these theories out of love and attention and the desire to make something coherent out of something that refuses to be fully coherent, are the truest part of the whole enterprise. Thank you for being one of them. Good night. If this is the kind of thing you want more of, subscribe. There will always be more. Good night, wherever you are. Epilogue. A letter to the town. Quahog, Rhode Island. A place that does not exist on any map that would acknowledge it. A zip code that leads nowhere. A founding myth built on a singing contest and an act of exile. A family living on a street whose layout changes depending on who is remembering it and when. A baby who accidentally created the universe. A dog who might be writing the whole thing down. This is the place we keep coming back to. Not because it is good to us. Not because it gives us what we came for, consistently, across all the seasons and all the episodes and all the years. Not because the characters do what we want them to do or say what we need them to say or grow in the ways we hope they will grow. It does not do those things. Not reliably. Not anymore. We keep coming back because something happened in the early seasons of this show that got into us and stayed there. Something about the specific combination of a stupid man who loves his family and a baby who is too smart for any of it, and a dog who reads books and drinks martinis and wishes he were something he cannot quite name, and a girl in a pink hat who sees everything and says almost nothing. Something about the way those people fit together, even when they are terrible to each other, even when the writers are not treating them well, even when the show seems to have forgotten what it was at its best. Something about the way they keep coming back to the same dinner table. The same couch, the same bar, the same house in the same town that should not exist. The theories in this script are love letters to that something. They are attempts to name it, to give it a shape, to explain why a cartoon about a Rhode Island family has generated this much sustained attention and this much genuine emotional investment from this many people over this many years. The theories say, because it is really about grief, because it is really about attachment, because it is really about a man who cannot let his family go, or a baby who cannot let time move forward, or a dog who cannot stop telling the story, or a girl who understands everything and waits for everyone else to catch up. All of those things might be true. None of them might be true. The show itself does not know which one to be, but the audience knows what it felt like to watch those early episodes when the show was new and the writing was sharp and the characters were still fully themselves. And the theories are the way the audience holds onto that feeling long after the show itself has mostly moved on from it. They are the way people keep the best version of the thing alive, in the face of the thing's own tendency to move away from what it was. That is not a small thing. That is the thing that keeps stories going after the people who made them have stopped caring as much as they once did. That is the thing that makes a show last 25 years and still be talked about, and still be theorized about, and still be watched by people lying in the dark at some hour that is a little too late to be reasonable. The lights in the house on Spooner Street are on. They have been on for 25 years. They will probably be on for years more. Come back whenever you need to. We will be here.